There is a particular quality of light in the late afternoon of an old house. It comes through the tall windows slowly, thickening as the sun descends, and it settles over everything it touches with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. Dust moves through it, barely visible, like a thought that has not yet become words. The floors creak in the same places they always have. The curtains hold still. In the study at the back of the house, a man sits at his desk. He is not young. The desk is large, made of mahogany, and the surface of it holds the accumulated weight of a working life. Ledgers, correspondence, a brass inkwell that has not been filled recently, a glass paperweight that catches the afternoon light and holds it in a small warm globe. The man is looking at the ledger that lies open before him, but he is not reading it. He is watching someone else read it. The someone else is a girl. She sits in the chair across the desk, the chair that is usually reserved for business visitors, for the men who come to discuss terms and arrangements, and the particular mathematics of inheritance and commerce. She's perhaps 14. Her posture is careful and attentive. Her finger moves along the column of figures with the slow precision of someone who's learning to see what the numbers mean, not merely to read what they say. The man watches her. The light moves. Somewhere in the house, a door opens and closes. The girl does not look up from the ledger. The man does not speak. This is a lesson, though it has no name, and it is happening as it always happens, in the quiet space between what the world expects and what a father decides to do instead. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There is a moment, somewhere in the last quarter of the 19th century, when a man looks down at the child in the cradle and understands that the world he has built will not pass to a son. The child is a girl. This has happened before, perhaps twice, perhaps 3 times. The son he expected, the son he needed to carry the name forward, to learn the business, to sit in the chair behind the mahogany desk and know what the desk means, has simply not arrived. The nursemaid adjusts the blanket. The doctor collects his bag. The household returns to its rhythms, and the man stands at the window of his study, looking out at the street below, at the carriages moving through the late afternoon light, at the city going about its business the way it always does, indifferent to the particular crisis of succession that has just announced itself in the room upstairs. This was not an uncommon moment in Gilded Age America. The men who built the great fortunes of the 19th century, the railroad men and the steel men, and the men who moved money through institutions that had not existed before they created them, these men were bound by inheritance laws and social conventions that had changed very little since the colonial era. A daughter could receive, she could be provided for, settled, married to a suitable man who would then control what she had been given. But a daughter could not, in the understanding of the time, carry a legacy forward. She could not be the heir in the sense that mattered. She could not be the continuation of the enterprise. And yet the enterprise existed. The business stood. The property generated income. The name meant something in the offices and the exchange floors and the drawing rooms where decisions were made. Someone had to learn it. Someone had to be prepared to understand it, to protect it, to keep it from dissolving in the hands of a son-in-law who might not share the founder's instincts or his particular vision of what the thing was supposed to be. So some fathers, quietly, without announcement, with the casual decisiveness of men who were accustomed to making things work when the conventional approach had failed them, began to educate their daughters as they would have educated sons. The decision was rarely stated directly. It did not require a declaration or a formal announcement or a family conference in which the unusual nature of what was being planned was acknowledged. It happened in small gestures, accumulated over years. The daughter who was taken to the office on a Tuesday when other fathers were taking their sons. The daughter who sat at her father's elbow while he read his correspondence, and was encouraged to ask questions about what she read. The daughter who was given a horse and taught to manage it, who was brought along on business trips to cities where the family held interests, who was introduced to men of affairs not as a charming daughter, to be admired and spoken to sweetly, but as a young person being educated in the way that young persons of consequence should be educated. These daughters occupied a strange position in the social order of the Gilded Age. They were, by the conventions of their class, expected to marry, to enter drawing rooms and ballrooms with the grace that their education and their money had provided, to take their place in the elaborate social machinery that the women of their world maintained with such extraordinary effort. They were expected to call and be called upon, to manage households, to present themselves at the right dinners and subscribe to the right charities, and wear the right things at the right moments, and conduct themselves in all the 1,000 specific ways that membership in their social world required. And at the same time, they were being prepared for something else entirely. They were learning that business was not mysterious, that it was a set of practices and principles that could be understood and applied by anyone with the intelligence and the attention to learn them. They were learning that money had mechanics, that it moved according to rules that could be studied. They were learning that the men their fathers met with, the lawyers and the bankers, and the men from the railroad companies, and the men from the insurance offices, were not a separate order of beings with special access to knowledge unavailable to others. They were practitioners of a set of skills, and their fathers had decided to teach those skills to them. The tension between these two educations defined the lives of these women in ways that would take decades to fully understand and that in many cases were never fully resolved. They were being formed in two directions at once, toward the parlour and toward the counting house, and the pull of each against the other created something that the Gilded Age had no category for, something that would have to find its own name, in its own time, through the particular lives that these particular women managed to live. Let us begin with the houses, because the houses are where everything started, and they tell the story before any of the people do. They contain the story in their physical arrangement, in the rooms they provided and the rooms they withheld, in the back stairs and the formal stairs, in the space between the study and the parlour that was also the space between two different versions of a woman's life. The great houses of the Gilded Age were built to impress and to contain. They rose on Fifth Avenue and on the cliffs of Newport and on the hilltops of Pittsburgh and on the wide boulevards of the cities where the new money had accumulated. They had rooms whose purpose was to declare the status of the family that inhabited them, ballrooms that existed only a few nights each year, but that required the labour of dozens of people to maintain in readiness, libraries filled with books that established learning without necessarily embodying it, conservatories full of plants that required constant tending to survive in a climate they were not native to. The houses were, in a sense, arguments. They argued for the permanence and the significance of the families they contained. Every carved moulding, every piece of imported marble, every silk wall covering, every silver candelabrum was making a case. The case was that this family had arrived, had established itself, had become the kind of entity that endures, that has a place in the world that is real and recognised and durable. And yet the families were, in many cases, only a generation or two away from their origins. The railroad fortunes dated from the 1840s and 50s. The steel fortunes dated from the years after the Civil War. The men who built these houses were, in historical terms, new. Their wealth was new. Their position was new. Their children and grandchildren were the first generation to have grown up inside this kind of grandeur, to have taken it as the natural condition of their existence rather than as the achievement it represented. The daughters of these houses grew up surrounded by evidence of what their fathers had built. They saw the ledgers and the offices even when they were not brought explicitly into them. They heard the conversations at dinner tables where business was discussed with the mixture of pride and strategy that characterized men of affairs talking about what they had made and what they planned to make next. They absorbed, through the simple fact of living inside these households, a great deal about the mechanics of the world their fathers operated in. Some daughters absorbed it more deliberately than others. Some had fathers who noticed the absorption and encouraged it. These are the daughters we are concerned with tonight, the ones who were not simply witnesses to the enterprise their fathers had created, but who were drawn into it, educated in its details, prepared for a role that the world around them insisted no woman should occupy. The education was practical before it was formal. It began in the ordinary moments of daily life, in the questions a father answered or declined to answer, in the attention he paid or didn't pay to the particular child who seemed to understand what was being discussed. A girl who asked about the railroad line and received a genuine explanation, rather than a gentle redirection toward more appropriate topics. A girl who was allowed to read the financial pages when they arrived with the morning papers, and who read them with the kind of attention that makes a person want to read more. A girl who was taken, just once at first, to see where the money came from, the mill or the mine or the counting room, and who remembered what she saw there with the completeness of memory that belongs to early and formative experiences. The study in many of these houses was a room that children did not routinely enter. It was the father's space, the room where the business of the enterprise was conducted in the home, where the papers and the account books and the correspondence lived. It had a smell that distinguished it from the rest of the house, the smell of paper and of leather and of ink and sometimes of cigar smoke, absorbed into the walls and the curtains over years of daily use. It was a room that declared itself through its smell before you had taken in anything else about it. A daughter who was brought into this room and kept coming back into it, and was eventually expected in it, had a relationship to it that was different from the relationship other daughters had to the rooms of their houses. It was a room that meant something specific, that contained specific knowledge. That was the place where the enterprise her father had built was made comprehensible and navigable. Coming into this room was not the same as coming into the parlour or the dining room or any of the other rooms of the social life. It was coming into the place where something different was happening. The daughters who came to know this room as part of their daily world became, through that familiarity, people who belonged to two different spaces in a way that most women of their era did not. They belonged to the parlour, and they belonged to the study. They knew how to be in both and what both required. They moved between them as naturally as breathing, because they had been doing it long enough for the movement to feel natural. This dual belonging was not a gift given without cost. It created complications that a simpler belonging would not have created. It made these daughters people who understood things that the world of the parlour insisted they did not understand, who knew things the social world insisted they should not know, who'd been shaped by an education that left them prepared for a role that their world had no official space for. But it also made them, in ways that would take decades to fully manifest, remarkably capable. They had the social skills of women who'd been raised in the elaborate social world of the Gilded Age, skills that were genuinely sophisticated and genuinely valuable, skills of relationship management and presentation, and the particular intelligence of people who have been trained to read rooms and manage impressions. And they had the business skills of people who'd been educated in the mechanics of the enterprise, skills of analysis and decision, and the practical management of resources. The combination was unusual. The world they lived in was not organised to make use of it. But it was there, and they carried it with them through their lives, and they used it in the ways that were available to them, and those ways were more numerous than the world officially acknowledged. The afternoon light continued to move through the houses. The floors continued to creak in the same places. The clocks on the mantelpieces kept their regular time. And in the study, in the morning hours before the social day began, a father and his daughter sat across a desk from each other and talked about the things that mattered, in the direct, serious, unsentimental way that the serious discussion of practical matters requires. The daughter listened, the father explained. And something was being built between them that was not only the transmission of specific knowledge about specific business matters, but the transmission of a way of thinking about the world, a habit of analysis, a comfort with complexity, a willingness to sit with difficulty and work through it rather than looking for a simpler version of the problem. These were the qualities that the unusual education produced. Not only the knowledge of how a particular business worked, but the general capacity that comes from being treated, from an early age, as someone whose thinking about serious matters is worth taking seriously, as someone who is capable of understanding complex things and who should be given the opportunity to understand them. This was, in the Gilded Age, a gift that most women did not receive. The social world's assumptions about women's capacities limited what women were offered, and therefore limited what they developed. The daughters who were offered more, who were treated as capable of more, developed more, not because they were inherently different from other women, but because the expectation of capacity tends, in the long run, to produce the capacity it expects. The houses held all of this, absorbing it the way old houses absorbed the lives lived in them, into the walls and the floors and the air, into the particular atmosphere of rooms where certain kinds of things have always happened. The study where the morning conversations took place became, over the years, a room that breathed with the accumulated presence of all those mornings. It was a room where a daughter had been told, without those exact words being used, that she was capable, and that her capacity mattered, and that the world she was being prepared for was the world of actual things, rather than only the world of social performance. And the daughter had believed it, because her father had told her it was true, and because every morning of sitting in that room and working through the papers and the columns and the questions had confirmed that it was true. She could do this work. She understood it. She belonged here as surely as she belonged in the parlour, and the fact that the world outside this room did not agree with that assessment was the world's problem, not hers. Or so she told herself in the mornings, in the room that smelled of paper and leather and ink, in the hours before the social day began, in the quiet that belonged to the study and the study alone. What she would do with this belief, in the world that waited for her outside the study door, was a question she would spend the rest of her life answering. The world had its own views about what she was capable of, and what role was appropriate for her, and those views were not the same as her father's views or her own. The negotiation between what she knew herself to be, and what the world was prepared to acknowledge her as being, was the central negotiation of her life, and it was never simple and it was never fully resolved. But it began here, in the study, in the morning light, in the serious conversation between a father who had decided to teach and a daughter who had decided to learn. It began with the simple act of being taken seriously by someone whose opinion of what was serious mattered enormously. The light moved through the windows, the fire crackled in the grate if it was winter, or the windows stood open to the morning air if it was summer. The papers were there, as they were always there, waiting to be read and understood and acted on, and the daughter who would eventually have to act on them was sitting across the desk from the man who had built them into existence, learning what she would need to know. The rooms of the great Gilded Age houses had names that declared their purposes: the parlour, the morning room, the drawing room, the library, the dining room, the ballroom. Each name was a social declaration, announcing not merely the function of the space, but the kind of life that required such a space and the kind of family that could maintain it. A family with a ballroom was a family of a particular kind. A family whose library was actually used was a family of a different particular kind. The rooms declared what the family was before a word was spoken by anyone in them. The study was the room that declared the presence of a man who worked, which in the Gilded Age context meant not merely a man who held a position, but a man who actively managed the enterprise that had produced the family's position. Many wealthy families of the era had men who held positions, who sat on boards and whose names appeared on the letterheads of companies, without those men being genuinely involved in the management of the enterprise. The study of the man who actually worked, who sat at the desk and read the papers and made the decisions, had a different atmosphere from the study that was merely decorative, that existed to declare a kind of seriousness without embodying it. The daughters who were taken into the working study, who were expected in it, who came to it as naturally as they came to the morning room, were being given access to something more specific than the general world of business. They were being given access to the specific world of their father's management, which was an active, inhabited world with its own texture and its own demands and its own particular way of understanding problems. This specificity was both an advantage and a limitation. The advantage was that the knowledge was concrete, grounded in the actual mechanics of an actual enterprise, not abstract and theoretical, but real and practical in the fullest sense. The limitation was that it was the knowledge of one enterprise, one set of circumstances, one particular configuration of the business world as it existed at a specific time and place. When circumstances changed, when the enterprise itself changed, or the world around it changed in ways that made the specific knowledge less directly applicable, the daughter had to work from the general principles her education had given her, rather than from the specific knowledge. The most capable of these daughters were the ones who had absorbed not only the specific knowledge, but the principles behind it, who had understood enough of why the business worked the way it worked, to be able to reason from those whys when the specific hows needed to be adapted to change circumstances. This was the deeper transmission, the one that lasted beyond the specific conditions that had produced it, and it was the transmission that the best of these fathers, the ones who were most deliberate in their teaching, were most trying to accomplish. A father who told his daughter what to do with the business was giving her instructions. A father who helped his daughter understand why the business worked the way it worked, what principles underlay the specific decisions, what the relationship was between the specific choices and the general conditions that made them right or wrong choices, was giving her something more durable. He was giving her the capacity to reason about the business, which is different from the knowledge of the business and is, in the long run, more valuable. The daughters who received this deeper transmission were, when the circumstances required, able to do more than execute the plans their fathers had put in place. They were able to form new plans when the old ones were no longer applicable. They were able to identify when the conditions had changed and what those changes implied. They were able to think which is the most fundamental capacity the education could produce. The morning light in the study was the light of thinking, not the bright light of performance or the soft light of social grace, but the particular light of a room where someone is sitting with a difficult problem and working it through. It had in it the quality of seriousness without urgency, of full attention applied to something that deserves full attention. It was the light in which the daughters who received the deepest versions of this education did their most important work. The social world of the Gilded Age was organised, to a degree that later eras would find remarkable, around the visibility of wealth. The houses were visible, the servants were visible, the carriages and the jewels and the dinner parties were visible. The social competition that structured the upper reaches of the world was a competition conducted in public, or in the specific semi-public of the drawing room and the opera box in the resort hotel. But there was a part of the Gilded Age world that was not visible, that was deliberately conducted outside the range of the social gaze. The study was one of the spaces of this invisibility. The accounting was conducted there. The correspondence with lawyers and bankers was conducted there. The decisions about the direction of the enterprise were made there, and the education of the daughter who had no brother was conducted there. The invisibility of the education was not accidental. It was, in part, a protective strategy. The social world had strong views about the appropriate education of daughters, and those views did not include the study. A father who was seen to be teaching his daughter the management of his business was doing something that the social world would have found irregular and possibly unseemly. The education happened in private because private was the only place it could happen without attracting the kind of attention that would have made it harder to sustain. But the invisibility was also, in a deeper sense, the nature of the thing itself. The education in the study was intimate, conducted in the specific register of the relationship between a father and a daughter who trusted each other and who had developed, over time, the particular language of that trust. It was not something that could have been conducted in public without changing its essential nature. The daughter who sat in the study and learned the ledger was learning something that required the particular privacy of that space, the particular intimacy of that relationship. The study was not just where the education happened, it was why the education was possible. The fathers who provided this education were men of their time in every other respect. They maintained the social forms, they observed the conventions, they participated in the world that organised itself around the assumption of male authority. Within that world, they had concluded, without necessarily examining the conclusion too closely, that the person they trusted most with the future of what they had built was the daughter across the desk. The conclusion was private. The action it produced was private. The world outside the study did not need to know about it, and in most cases the world outside the study did not know. This privacy had a cost. The women who had been given their fathers' educations did not have, when they needed to use what they had learned, the public credential of having learned it. There was no diploma, no professional standing, no formal acknowledgement that the education had taken place. There was only the capacity itself, the specific knowledge and the specific habits of mind that the education had produced, and the capacity had to establish itself in the world through demonstration rather than through credential. The demonstration was ongoing and sometimes arduous. Every new professional relationship required a fresh demonstration of the competence that the credential would have announced in advance. Every new situation required the specific application of the knowledge that the education had built. The capacity was real, but the recognition of it was never automatic. It had to be earned, repeatedly, in the specific context of the specific situations that required it. The daughters who did this work, who spent their working lives demonstrating a capacity that the world had not been prepared to receive, were not complaining about it, at least not in the records that survive. They were managing the situation as they managed all situations, with the practical intelligence that their fathers had cultivated in them, with the attention to what was actually required and the willingness to provide it, with the steady persistence that the education had, perhaps most importantly of all, taught them to bring to difficult work. The fathers who made the decision to educate their daughters in the management of their affairs were, in most cases, practical men who had built practical things, and who approached the problem of succession with the same practicality they brought to the other problems of their working lives. The sentiment was there, the love of a father for a daughter, the desire to see the work of a lifetime continue in capable hands. But the sentiment was not the reason for the decision. The reason was practical. The best available candidate for the management of the inheritance was the daughter, and the daughter required an education that the conventional educational system of the era did not provide. The practicality of the decision was also its limitation. The fathers who made it were not making a statement about the capacity of women in general. They were making a specific decision about a specific daughter in a specific set of circumstances. The generalization was not part of the agenda. The social world did not need to be reformed. The conventions did not need to be challenged. The specific problem of succession needed to be solved, and the solution happened to involve the daughter receiving an education that the conventions did not expect her to receive. This specificity was both the strength and the weakness of the arrangement. Its strength was that it was practical and immediate and focused on the actual problem at hand, which made it effective in the specific situation it was designed to address. Its weakness was that it did not challenge the conventions that had created the problem in the first place, that it left the social world intact while working around the specific obstacle the social world had placed in the way of the practical solution. The daughter was educated in private, in the study, in the intimacy of the family relationship, without any public acknowledgement that the education was happening or any social consequence for the world that had made the private arrangement necessary. The world changed anyway, through the accumulation of many private arrangements that had the same shape, through the gradual recognition that the capacity to manage substantial affairs was more widely distributed than the social world had assumed, through the legislative and legal changes that the progressive era and the women's movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought about. The private arrangements in the study were not the cause of these changes, but they were, in their accumulated weight, part of the evidence that the changes were appropriate, part of the demonstration that the women who were being given the legal capacity to manage their own affairs already had, in many cases, the practical capacity that the legal capacity would now allow to function. Mourning in a Gilded Age house of consequence began before any of the family stirred, and this was as true in the houses of the daughters we are considering as in any other house of that era and that station. The darkness before dawn held a particular quality in these large rooms, a settled stillness that felt like the house breathing between its human activities, and into this stillness the household moved first, before the family woke. The fires had to be laid, in the rooms where the family slept, in the parlours and the sitting rooms where they would spend the morning hours, in the study where the father would eventually appear with his coffee and his newspapers. The fires had to be prepared and lit so that the house would be warm when the family descended. This was the first labour of the day, performed in silence and in the half-light before the household clock had reached even 6 o'clock, by the housemaids who moved through the cold rooms with the efficiency of long practice, carrying the coal and the kindling and the matches, laying the grates in the specific order that experience had established as most reliable. The cook had risen before even the housemaids, because the kitchen had its own morning requirements that preceded the requirements of the rooms above. The range had to be stoked, the water had to be set on for the coffee and the tea, the bread, if it was a bread day, had been set to rise the night before and now needed to be shaped and placed in its tins and put near the warmth for its final rise before baking. The morning's work in the kitchen was the invisible foundation of everything else that would happen in the house that day, and it happened in the pre-dawn quiet, in the warmth of the kitchen that was the first warm room in the house each morning. For the daughters being educated in ways their world did not expect, morning had a particular character that was different from the morning of other daughters of their station. They were, by the standard of their class, expected to rise at a reasonable hour, to descend for breakfast looking well, and presenting themselves as the social beings they were also being trained to be. The education in the account books and the business correspondence was not supposed to disturb the surface of a young lady's life. It was supposed to happen underneath, invisible to the social world, in the spaces that the social world did not look into too carefully. But some of these daughters found, as they grew, that the morning hours were the most honest. The household had not yet assembled itself into its social performance. The parlour, before the calling hours began, was just a room with good light coming through long windows. The study, before the father's appointments arrived and before the social machinery of the day set itself in motion, was just a desk and some chairs and the papers that told the story of the enterprise in their columns and their figures and their accounts of what had happened and what was projected to happen. There was a particular quality to this early morning time that the daughters who moved in it recognized and valued. It was the quality of the world before it had put on its public face, before the elaborate performances of social position and social obligation had begun for the day. In this early morning time, a daughter could sit across from her father and discuss the railroad accounts, or the manufacturing costs, or the condition of the money markets in New York, without any of the social apparatus that would normally surround such a conversation pressing in on it. The quality of the morning light in these houses varied with the season and the orientation of the room, and the particular character of the day. In winter, the light came late and came grey, filtering through frost on the windows that the housemaid would have scraped and polished before the family descended. In summer, the light came early and golden, arriving in the study before the family did, and warming the papers on the desk and the leather of the chairs, and the old wood of the bookshelves with the particular warmth of early morning sun. The autumn mornings were perhaps the most beautiful, or at least the most characteristically autumnal, with the particular quality of light that belongs to October and November, a light that is simultaneously clear and warm, and carries in it the knowledge that it will not last, that the winter is coming and the days will shorten, and the light will change to something different. The daughters who sat in the study in October mornings, with the light coming through the leaves that were turning outside the window, were having their morning conversations in a frame that was objectively lovely, even if the content of the conversation was account books and business correspondence. The content of these morning conversations was the content of the enterprise, the specific, practical, detailed substance of what the business was and how it worked, and what it needed to continue working. The father who had built something had, in the process of building it, developed a comprehensive understanding of its mechanics, the way that every part of it depended on every other part, the way that a change in one element propagated through the system and required adjustments in other elements. This understanding was not something that could be transmitted in a single conversation or a month of conversations. It required years of patient attention, of question and answer, of looking at the same problems from different angles, until the understanding was genuinely deep rather than merely superficial. The daughters who received this transmission, over the years of their childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, were receiving something that was in some ways more valuable than a formal business education would have been, if such a thing had been available to women of their era and class. A formal education would have given them general principles and frameworks. What their fathers were giving them was specific knowledge of a specific enterprise, the knowledge of people who understand a thing from the inside because they have spent years thinking about it carefully in the company of someone who built it. This specific knowledge was not always transferable to other enterprises or other situations. What a daughter learned about managing a textile manufacturing concern was not directly applicable to managing a banking house, but the habits of mind that the learning produced were transferable, the habit of looking at a problem from multiple angles before reaching a conclusion, the habit of testing assumptions against the evidence rather than assuming the evidence would conform to the assumptions, the habit of distinguishing between what was known and what was surmised, and of being honest with oneself about the difference. These were the habits of mind that the morning conversations transmitted, alongside the specific knowledge about the specific enterprise, and these habits, when they had been sufficiently developed, were available to their possessor in whatever situation she found herself in, whatever business or problem or negotiation she was required to navigate. They were the gift beneath the gift, the thing that lasted when the specific circumstances to which the specific knowledge applied had changed. The morning routine of the household continued around all of this. The fires were laid and lit, the breakfast was prepared in the kitchen, and carried up to the dining room by the maids who moved through the back passages with the efficiency and the invisibility that the household's operation required. The silver was polished in the butler's pantry. The newspapers were ironed and placed in the order the family would read them. The calling cards from the previous day were sorted and presented to the mistress of the house on the silver tray that lived on the hall table for exactly this purpose. All of this happened as it happened in every household of this station, because the morning routines of these households were standardized by the social world's expectations to a degree that left very little room for variation. A household that deviated significantly from the expected morning routine was a household that was signaling something about its position in the social world, and the signal was rarely a comfortable one. So the morning routines conformed, and within the conforming morning routines the quiet education continued. At the breakfast table, if the father chose to discuss the papers there. In the study, if the daughter had learned to arrive there early, and to make herself useful in the time before the day's appointments began. In the carriage on the way to the office, if the father had decided to take the daughter along on the pretext of an errand that required her presence. The variety of occasions in which the transmission happened was limited only by the ingenuity of the father in finding them, and by the willingness of the daughter to make herself available for them without making a spectacle of the availability. Both things were required, and both were present in the cases where the transmission was most successful. There was a daughter in a house in Philadelphia in the years after the Civil War whose father had built a manufacturing concern that produced iron goods, which is to say, goods made of iron that were used in the construction of the expanding industrial economy. He had started small, with a forge and 2 workers, and had built it over 30 years into something that employed several hundred people, and that made goods that went into railroad cars and farm machinery, and the building of the cities that were expanding across the middle of the continent. He had no sons. He had a wife who was a woman of great practical intelligence and considerable social grace, and 3 daughters, of whom the oldest was named Margaret. Margaret had her father's habit of listening before speaking, his way of looking at a problem from several angles before committing to a direction, and his capacity for patience in the face of complexity. She had also her mother's social intelligence, and her mother's ability to manage the elaborate machinery of a social life that the family's position required. What she was acquiring, in the mornings in her father's study, and in the occasional visits to the manufacturing concern that her father had begun to include her in when she was still young enough for such visits to seem merely curious rather than significant, was the specific knowledge of how the iron goods business worked. She was learning what the orders looked like, and where they came from, and what determined whether the business could meet them. She was learning about the suppliers who provided the raw material and the relationships that kept those suppliers reliable, and the circumstances that made them unreliable. She was learning about the men who managed the forge on her father's behalf, and the particular management challenges that the work created. None of this education was announced. Her mother knew it was happening and did not object because her mother was a practical woman who understood that Margaret was going to need to understand these things sooner rather than later. Her younger sisters were absorbed in the social life of the household and the neighbourhood, and the particular pleasures of being pretty girls in a wealthy family in a city that had pleasant things to offer pretty girls in wealthy families. Margaret moved between the 2 worlds with a facility that she had been developing since childhood. She went to the morning room and discussed the accounts with her father. She descended to the parlour and received callers with the grace that her station required. She attended the dinners and the concerts and the charitable events that the family's social position demanded. She managed, with considerable skill, the presentation of herself as exactly what the social world wanted her to be, which allowed the other education to continue without attracting more attention than it needed to attract. The mornings were hers. In the early hours, before the social machinery had assembled itself, she was the daughter in the study, learning what her father knew. In the later hours, when the day's social obligations began, she was the daughter of good family, doing what daughters of good family were supposed to do. The transition between the 2 was one she had learned to make with such smoothness that it was invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. The smell of the morning house was specific. There was the smell of the wood fires that had been lit in the rooms where the family would spend the morning, a smell that was in winter one of the most immediately comforting smells available, the smell of warmth being made where there had been cold. There was the smell of coffee, which arrived with breakfast and which in that era was prepared in a way that produced a richer and more present smell than the coffee of later times. There was the smell of newsprint, which was a sharper, more acidic smell that belonged specifically to the morning and to the particular ritual of reading the papers before the day's demands had fully arrived. And beneath all of these, the smell of the house itself, the smell that accumulated in old houses through the absorption of years of domestic life into the walls and the floors and the fabric of curtains and upholstered furniture. Each old house had its own version of this smell, and anyone who had grown up in an old house knew their own house's version of it, with the completeness of something absorbed in childhood. Margaret knew the smell of her father's study particularly well. It was the smell of the room where the important conversations happened, and it was associated in her memory with the quality of attention that those conversations required and produced. When she sat in that room, the smell was part of what prepared her for the work. It told her body, before her mind had fully oriented itself, that she was in the place where the serious thinking happened, and her body responded by settling into the particular posture of concentration that the work required. This is the kind of learning that happens beneath the level of consciousness, the learning that is absorbed through the body over many repetitions of the same experience until it becomes automatic. Margaret had sat in this room so many times, in the presence of her father's serious attention to the business of the enterprise, that the room itself had become part of the education. The education was not only in the words and the figures and the explanations. It was in the atmosphere of the room, in the quality of attention that the room produced, in the bodily knowledge of what serious thinking felt like and what it required. Outside the study, the house continued its morning. The cook had put the bread to bake, and the smell of baking bread was beginning to move through the back of the house, up from the kitchen through the passages that connected the working part of the house to the living part of the house. The laundress was in the laundry room at the back, beginning the long labour of the weekly wash. The garden, if it was summer, was already being attended to by the gardener, who moved through its beds with the patient attention of someone who understands that a garden requires daily presence to remain what it is supposed to be. All of this was the ordinary morning of the house, and within it the extraordinary morning, the morning that was building something unusual out of the simple materials of a father and a daughter and the papers on a desk, continued. The particular virtue of the morning in these houses was that it was the time before the social performance had assembled itself. It was the time when a person could be most simply who they were, before the elaborate construction of the social self was required. And what Margaret was in the morning in the study was a person who understood account books and business correspondence and the mechanics of the iron goods trade. This was as real a part of her identity as any other part, and the morning was the time when it could exist without the social performance pressing in on it from all sides. When the morning ended and the social day began, this part of her identity went underground. Not because she forgot it or denied it, but because the social world that she moved in did not have a place for it, and making it visible would have required a confrontation with the social world's assumptions that she was not, at this stage of her life, equipped to sustain. The confrontation would come later, when circumstances required it. For now, she managed the situation in the way that it could be managed, by keeping the two educations running in parallel, each in its appropriate time and place. The morning light moved through the study windows and fell on the pages of the account book and on the hands that were turning them. Outside, the city was beginning its day, the sounds of it arriving through the heavy walls in muffled form. The clocks marked the passage of time in their regular intervals. The fire settled as it burned and was rebuilt to keep the room warm. And the education continued, as it had continued for years and would continue for more years, in the simple daily repetition of presence and attention and the transmission of knowledge from a father who understood what he had built to a daughter who was learning to understand it too. The particular culture of the wealthy American household in the last decades of the 19th century was a culture that managed two things simultaneously: the display of what had been achieved and the careful management of those who observed the display. The house was a theatre, but it was also a practical machine for the management of daily life, and the two functions required different kinds of expertise and generated different kinds of knowledge. The expertise of display was the expertise of the social world, the knowledge of the right objects in the right arrangement, the correct sequence of the rooms, the appropriate quality of the staff and the service and the food. This was the expertise that the mistress of the house was responsible for managing, and it was a genuine expertise that required real intelligence and real practical skill applied over many years to become fully competent. The expertise of the machine was different, and in many of these houses it operated largely invisibly, below the level of what the display required to be noticed. The cook's management of the kitchen's labour, and the budget and the organisation of the storage of food and the planning of menus across weeks and months. The housekeeper's management of the cleaning and the linens and the scheduling of the maids and the maintenance of the household's inventory. The butler's management of the wine cellar and the formal service and the training of the footman and the protocol of the front door. All of this was the machine of the household, and it was in the charge of the professional household staff rather than directly in the charge of the mistress, though the mistress oversaw it and was responsible for its overall functioning. The daughters who moved between the parlour and the study were, in a sense, moving between the display and the machine. The parlour was display. The study was a different kind of machine, the machine of the business, but a machine nonetheless, operated by the application of expertise to specific practical problems. The connection between these two kinds of machine, the domestic machine and the business machine, was not always visible. But it was real. Both required the management of resources, human and material, over time and against uncertainty. Both required the making of decisions under conditions of incomplete information. Both required the skill of managing the people through whom the machine operated, the ability to deploy human capability effectively, and to maintain the relationships that the deployment required. A woman who had been trained in the management of a complex household, who understood how to balance competing demands on limited resources, how to plan ahead for variable conditions, how to maintain the standards that the household's position required, while managing the practical realities of cost and availability and the inevitable difficulties that arose, had skills that were directly applicable to the management of a business enterprise. The transfer was not automatic, and it was not always recognized by the women themselves or by the men around them. But it was possible, and for women who were also receiving a more explicit business education from their fathers, it provided a foundation that made the business education more grounded. The mornings in the kitchen, if a daughter visited the kitchen as some daughters did, were mornings in a room that was all practical intelligence, no display. The cook who managed a large Gilded Age kitchen was managing a significant operation with its own logistics and its own economics and its own personnel management requirements. The kitchen had its own hierarchy, its own rhythms, its own specific expertise that was the product of long experience. A daughter who spent time in the kitchen was seeing, in a different register, the same principles that appeared in the account books of the business. This was not an observation that the era would have articulated explicitly. The parallel between domestic management and business management was not a conceptual framework that the Gilded Age had developed, but the parallel was there in the practical reality of what good management looked like and what it required. And daughters who moved through the whole house, from the parlour to the study to the kitchen to the garden, were absorbing the parallel even if they could not have named it. The sound of the morning in these houses was specific. The fire in the grate if it was winter, the particular sound of coal settling as it burned, the movement of the maids through the rooms above and below, their footsteps distinguishable by the quality of the floors they were crossing and the specific pace of their work. The sound of the kitchen, muffled by the distance and the walls but audible as a general presence of activity, a hum of domestic labour that rose from below the house in the morning and accompanied the day throughout. These sounds were the sounds of the machine operating. They were ordinary and familiar, and like all ordinary and familiar things, they disappeared below conscious attention after long enough exposure. But they were there, and they were the sonic texture of the world in which the morning education occurred, the world against which the conversation about the account books took place, the world that was doing its practical work while the more unusual work of the study proceeded. The management of the household staff in a Gilded Age house of the first rank was itself an enterprise of some complexity. The cook, the housekeeper, the parlour maid, the kitchen maid, the housemaids for the various floors of the house, the laundress, the nurse for the children, the lady's maid for the mistress of the house, the butler and the footman in the houses that maintained them, the coachman and the stable hands in the houses that kept horses, the gardener and the garden staff in the houses with substantial grounds. Each of these positions had specific duties and specific relationships with the other positions, and the management of the whole required a clear understanding of those duties and relationships and the willingness to address the situations that arose when the duties were not performed, or when the relationships between the staff members produced difficulties. The housekeeper was the primary manager of the domestic staff, the woman who translated the mistress's requirements into the specific instructions that the staff received and executed. A good housekeeper was invaluable, a woman who combined the managerial capacity to direct the work of a large and sometimes difficult staff with the social intelligence to manage the relationships between the staff members and with the family, and with the specific knowledge of the household standards and preferences that allowed her to maintain those standards consistently over time. The cook held a position of particular power in the household. Food was the most visible daily evidence of the household's management, the thing that was served at every meal, and that reflected, in its quality and its variety and its presentation, the competence of the kitchen and the standards of the house. A good cook was a valued employee, and cooks who had established their skills in houses of consequence were in a position to negotiate terms that reflected the value of what they provided. A cook who gave notice was a genuine crisis for the household, requiring the rapid identification and engagement of a suitable replacement, a process that was never easy, and that could, in the worst cases, result in a series of inferior arrangements before a satisfactory cook was found. The daughter who had been educated in the management of the broader enterprise understood the management of the household staff in the context of that broader understanding. She knew that the staff represented a significant portion of the household's expenditure, that the wages of the servants and the food they consumed and the materials they used in their work added up to a substantial recurring cost that had to be justified by the value they provided. She knew that the management of the staff, like the management of any other resource, required attention to performance and the willingness to address inadequate performance directly, rather than allowing it to continue from a reluctance to have the difficult conversation. The mornings were when the directions for the day were given. The housekeeper would come to the mistress, or to the daughter who served in the mistress's role, in the period after breakfast but before the social day had properly begun, and the conversation of that meeting would set the agenda for the household's work that day. What was to be cooked, and when? Which rooms were to be cleaned and to what standard? Whether visitors were expected and what arrangements were needed for them? Whether any of the staff had particular matters to address, any supplies that needed to be ordered, or any repairs that needed to be scheduled, or any situations that had arisen among the staff that required the mistress's attention. The daughter who had been educated in the study brought to these morning conversations the same quality of attention that she brought to the business correspondence. She listened to what the housekeeper reported with the specific awareness of someone who understood the management implications of what was being said, who recognized when a pattern of small difficulties was pointing to a larger problem, who knew when to defer to the housekeeper's judgment and when to exercise her own. The conversation was practical and direct, conducted in the register of the household's daily management, and the daughter who had learned to conduct business conversations with her father's lawyers and bankers conducted this conversation with the same quality of practical directness. The management of the household and the management of the estate were not, for the daughters who had been educated in both, two separate activities conducted in two separate registers. They were aspects of the same continuous management of the family's resources and relationships, requiring the same qualities of attention and intelligence and persistence, conducted at different scales and in different registers but fundamentally similar in what they demanded of the person who did them well. The question of inheritance law is, on its surface, a dry one. It concerns itself with the mechanisms by which property passes from one generation to the next, with the legal instruments that specify who receives what and under what conditions, with the rules that govern what happens when the person who accumulated the property has died without having specified clearly enough, or at all, how it should be distributed among the people who survive. In the Gilded Age, this dry question had an enormous and immediate weight in the lives of the daughters we are considering, because the laws of that era, in most of the American states where the great fortunes had accumulated, were built on assumptions about gender and capacity and the proper relationship between women and property that had been imported wholesale from the English common law tradition and had changed very little in the intervening centuries. The doctrine of coverture, which had governed the legal status of married women in England since the medieval period, held that upon marriage a woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She could not, as a married woman, own property in her own name in the common law sense. She could not enter into contracts independently, could not sue or be sued as an individual, could not make a will without her husband's consent. She ceased, in the strict legal sense, to exist as a separate person. The law regarded husband and wife as a single legal entity, and that entity was the husband. By the time the Gilded Age began to build its great fortunes, this doctrine was already being modified by legislation in various states. The Married Women's Property Acts, beginning with New York's in 1848, had begun the process of giving married women independent legal rights to the property they owned before marriage, and to the property they acquired during marriage through their own labour or as gifts. But the process was slow and uneven across the states, and the cultural assumptions that had produced coverture did not disappear simply because the law had begun to change. Laws change faster than the habits of mind that generated them. For the father of daughters in, say, 1875, who had built a significant enterprise, and who was thinking about what would happen to it when he was gone, the legal landscape was complicated by the specific circumstances of his family. If he had sons, the matter was relatively straightforward within the conventions of his world. The sons would inherit, would be educated in the business, would take over its management when the time came. The daughters would be provided for, settled with suitable portions, married to men who would care for them in the style appropriate to their station. But if he had no sons or only daughters, the situation was genuinely more complex. He could leave the business to his sons-in-law, but that required him to trust that the men his daughters married would have the intelligence and the character to manage what he had built. This was a considerable uncertainty. The men his daughters married would be men the daughters had chosen, and daughters were not always known for choosing men who would be good at running manufacturing concerns or managing railroad interests or navigating the particular challenges of the specific enterprise the father had spent his life building. He could leave it to a male relative, a nephew, or a cousin, or a brother's son, who might or might not have the temperament or the knowledge or the desire for the work. He could sell it and leave his daughters the proceeds, which was the simplest solution, but which required him to accept that the enterprise he had built, the thing he had given the best years of his life to building, would cease to exist as an independent entity. He could leave it to a board of trustees who would manage it for the benefit of his daughters, which preserved the enterprise in a formal sense but removed it from any form of meaningful family control. Or he could do what some of these fathers quietly did. He could spend the years before his death educating his daughter in the management of the business, and then leave it to her, directly or through a trust arrangement that gave her effective control, hoping that the combination of her competence and the legal structures he had put in place would allow her to manage what he had built. This last option required courage of a particular kind. It required the father to believe, against the prevailing wisdom of his era, that his daughter's capacity was real and sufficient for what he was proposing to ask of her. The legal mechanisms for accomplishing this were limited but real. A father could leave property in trust for his daughter, with provisions that gave her considerable practical control over how the trust assets were managed. He could arrange for her to receive income from the business, while technically leaving the management in the hands of a trustee who was instructed, formally or informally, to follow her direction. He could appoint her as executrix of the estate with broader powers than was typical for a woman in that role. He could write letters of instruction that, while not legally binding, made clear to the men who would be involved in the administration of the estate what he had intended for the enterprise and who he believed was best placed to carry out those intentions. None of these mechanisms were perfect. All of them left the daughter in a position that was formally dependent on the cooperation of the men around her, the trustees and the lawyers and the managers and the business partners who would continue to deal with the enterprise after the father was gone. If those men chose to cooperate, if they were willing to treat the daughter as having genuine authority, even when the legal structures did not fully and unambiguously confirm that authority, the arrangement could work. If they chose not to cooperate, if they decided to take advantage of the ambiguities in the legal arrangements, to assert their own control, or to manage the enterprise in ways the father had not intended, the daughter's position could become very precarious very quickly. This fragility was not abstract. It was the material condition of the inheritance situations these daughters faced when the time came. The father had prepared them. The legal arrangements had been made as carefully as the law and the father's specific circumstances allowed. And then the daughter was left to manage the situation with the tools she had, in a world that had not been organized to support her in managing it. The men who challenged these arrangements did so from a variety of motivations. Some were genuinely convinced that a woman could not manage a business effectively, and that their intervention, however technically illegal or against the spirit of the deceased father's intentions, was in the best interests of the enterprise. Some were motivated by straightforward financial self-interest, seeing in the ambiguity of the arrangements an opportunity to increase their own share of the proceeds. Some were simply operating from the default assumptions of their era about who was and who was not entitled to exercise authority in the commercial sphere. The daughters who defended their positions in these circumstances were doing so against the grain of everything the social world around them believed about how things should work. They were asserting a claim that the law technically supported, but that social custom did not, and they were doing it without the social tools that a man in the same position would have had available. A man who inherited a business could walk into a meeting of his board of directors and be presumed by everyone in the room to have the authority to chair that meeting. A woman who inherited a business walked into the same meeting and had to establish her authority before the meeting could accomplish anything, and the establishment required managing the resistance of men who had not expected to be in a room being directed by a woman. The strategies these daughters developed for this management were varied, and depended on the specific characters of the women and the specific circumstances of their situations. Some confronted the resistance directly and explicitly, asserting their legal rights in terms that left no room for ambiguity. Some approached it more obliquely, working through the men who were most disposed to cooperation and building consensus incrementally rather than demanding it all at once. Some found ways to make the men around them feel that the decisions they were making were jointly arrived at, even when the direction was primarily hers. The women who were most successful in these situations tended to be women who had not only the business knowledge, but the social skill to manage the relationships that the business knowledge required to be effective. They understood that knowing the right answer to a business problem was only part of the challenge. The rest of the challenge was getting the people around them to accept the right answer, and that required the management of their egos and their assumptions and their sense of what was appropriate in ways that the direct application of business knowledge alone could not accomplish. The legal world was changing slowly throughout the decades when these daughters were navigating their inheritance situations. The Married Women's Property Acts continued to be refined and extended. The courts, in the cases that came before them, were gradually developing a body of precedent that recognized women's capacity to manage property and business enterprises in ways that the older common law had not recognized. The legal landscape at the end of the 19th century was not the legal landscape of the middle of the 19th century. But legal change and social change were not the same thing and did not happen at the same rate. A woman might have the legal right to manage a trust fund, and the social world might still refuse to treat her as a legitimate participant in the business world, and the practical effect of that refusal might be to make the legal right largely unexercisable. The law and the social world operated in different registers, and the daughters who were navigating the space between them had to manage both simultaneously. The particular irony of the situation was that the very competence these daughters had been given was itself a source of vulnerability. A woman who knew exactly what was in the account books was also a woman who could be seen as threatening by the men who had previously had exclusive access to that knowledge. A woman who understood the business relationships and could identify when they were being managed in ways contrary to the interests of the estate was a woman who was more dangerous to resist than a woman who did not understand these things, but who was also more likely to face active resistance from men who recognized that her knowledge made her a real challenge to their control. The families in which this drama played out were, in the public version of the story, families that appeared perfectly conventional. The father had died. The estate was being administered. The daughter was managing the household as the widow would have managed it, or as the woman of the house managed it when the family's male figure was absent. Nothing that was visible to the social world was unusual. What was happening underneath the visible surface was the real drama: the negotiations with trustees, the meetings with lawyers, the letters written and the responses received or not received, the moments in the offices of the men of business when a woman sat across the desk from a man who had not expected to be having this conversation with a woman, and who was learning, with whatever degree of discomfort, that he was going to have it. The houses continued their lives around all of this. The social routines continued, the calling cards were left and received, the charitable subscriptions were maintained, the dinners were given, and the dinners were attended. And in the interstices of all this social performance, the real work of the inheritance was being done, in offices and in lawyers' rooms and in the studied evenings, when the daughter reviewed the latest correspondence and prepared for the next round of the ongoing negotiation. The light in the legal offices was, as has been noted, different from the morning light of the study. It was institutional light, the light of rooms where formal transactions were conducted, and it had the quality of deliberateness. It illuminated the papers and the faces across the table without sentiment, without the warmth of familiarity. This was light for seeing clearly, not for dreaming. And the daughters who sat in that light, looking at the papers that concerned the enterprise their fathers had built, were seeing clearly. They had been educated to see clearly. They had the tools, the knowledge and the competence and the habits of analytical thinking that the education had given them. Whether those tools would be sufficient to the specific challenges of the specific situations they were in was not yet fully known, but the tools were there, and they were ready to be used. The specific legal case of the Married Women's Property Acts deserves more attention than it typically receives in the general accounts of the Gilded Age, because it is the framework within which the practical situations of the daughters we are considering were played out, and understanding the framework is necessary for understanding why the situations were as complicated as they were. New York's Married Women's Property Act of 1848 was the first significant piece of legislation to modify the common law doctrine of coverture in an American state. It provided that property belonging to a woman at the time of her marriage, or property that she received as a gift or inheritance during her marriage, remained her separate property and was not subject to her husband's control or liable for his debts. This was a significant departure from the common law rule, which had made all of a woman's property pass to her husband's control upon marriage. The 1848 Act was followed by further legislation in 1860 and 1862 that extended the scope of married women's property rights in New York. The 1860 Act gave married women the right to keep their own earnings from their own labour or business, to sue and be sued in their own names with respect to their separate property, and to carry on trades and businesses as sole traders without their husband's involvement. This last provision was particularly significant for the situation of the daughters whose fathers had educated them in business management, because it meant that a married woman could, legally, conduct a business in her own name. But legal permission and practical reality were not the same thing. A married woman who wanted to conduct a business under the 1860 Act still needed capital to start or continue the business, and capital required access to credit, and credit required the trust of the people who provided it. The banks and the credit markets of the Gilded Age were operated by men who had been formed in a world where women did not conduct businesses, and whose assessment of a woman's creditworthiness was shaped by assumptions about women's capacity that the law had not changed, and that the law could not change directly. The practical difficulties were real and specific. A woman who presented herself at a bank to open a business account or to negotiate a line of credit was walking into a space where her presence was unexpected, and where the people with whom she was dealing had no established framework for assessing her request. They knew how to assess a man's request. They knew what questions to ask, what references to check, what track record to look for, what collateral to require. For a woman's request, they did not have this established framework, and in the absence of a framework, they fell back on the general assumption that women were not good credit risks for business purposes. The daughters who had been educated in business management were better positioned to navigate this specific difficulty than women who had no business education, because they could speak the language that the bank officers spoke. They could present the numbers in the form that the numbers needed to be in to be credible. They could answer the questions that the bank officers asked in terms that demonstrated they understood what the questions were asking. They could engage with the substance of the credit assessment in a way that challenged, by the simple fact of the engagement, the assumption that women were not capable of this kind of thing. This engagement was not always successful. The assumptions were sometimes more powerful than the evidence that challenged them, but it was more often successful than it would have been for a woman without the education, because the education had given these daughters the specific tools the specific challenge required. The trust law, which was the other major legal framework within which these daughters operated, was more nuanced than the property law in its treatment of women. The trustee of a Gilded Age trust was the legal owner of the trust property, managing it for the benefit of the beneficiaries, and the beneficiary, whether male or female, had limited formal control over the management decisions the trustee made. A female beneficiary who wanted the trust managed in a particular way had to persuade the trustee through whatever combination of legal pressure and personal negotiation the circumstances allowed. But the specifics of the trust instrument mattered enormously. A well-drafted trust instrument could give the beneficiary significant practical influence over the trustee's decisions, through provisions requiring the trustee to consult with the beneficiary before making major decisions, or requiring a co-trustee acceptable to the beneficiary, or providing mechanisms for the removal of a trustee who was not managing the trust in accordance with the beneficiary's legitimate interests. The fathers who had thought carefully about these legal structures, who had worked with their lawyers to draft trust instruments that gave their daughters as much practical authority as the law would allow, were doing something that had a direct and measurable effect on the daughters' subsequent situations. The legal structure was not everything, but it was not nothing. A trust instrument that supported the daughter's authority was a tool that made the assertion of that authority more possible, even in circumstances where the people around her were disinclined to accept it. The story of Gilded Age inheritance law, as it pertains to these daughters, is thus a story of the gap between what the law formally permitted and what the social world practically allowed, and of the various strategies that were developed for navigating that gap. The gap was real and it was wide and it was costly to navigate, but it was navigable for those who had the knowledge and the preparation and the specific practical intelligence that navigation required. The specific legal reality of coverture was one that the daughters who had been educated by their fathers encountered with a particular sharpness at the moment of marriage. Before marriage, the education that their fathers had given them had a clear practical application. They were being prepared to assist in the management of the estate during their father's lifetime and to take over that management after his death. The legal framework did not obstruct this preparation. An unmarried woman was a legal person. She could own property and manage it and enter into contracts. The education was building a capacity that the law did not prevent. At marriage, the legal framework changed. The coverture doctrine erased the legal personhood that the education had been preparing to use. The property that she had or would inherit passed into her husband's legal control. The contracts she entered into required her husband's consent. The legal identity that she had been given, however informally, by the years of education in the study was, at marriage, absorbed into the legal identity of the man she had married. The fathers who had given their daughters these educations had thought about this problem. They had thought about it in the specific practical way that men who had built substantial estates thought about practical problems, which is to say they had thought about the legal instruments available to address it, and about how those instruments could be deployed to preserve, as much as the law allowed, the practical authority of the daughter they had educated. The antenuptial agreement was one instrument, an agreement made before marriage specifying the terms under which the wife's property would be held and managed, could protect the property from the full force of coverture in states that recognized such agreements. The agreement required the consent of the intended husband, which meant that the negotiation of the agreement was itself a significant event, a test of whether the intended husband understood and accepted the terms on which the marriage was being offered. The fathers who insisted on antenuptial agreements as a condition of their daughters' marriages were, in effect, using the daughter's marriage as an opportunity to establish legal terms that protected what the daughter had been given. The husbands who agreed to those terms were, consciously or not, agreeing to a marriage that was different from the conventional Gilded Age marriage in a specific and legally significant way. The wife in such a marriage retained something of the legal independence that the education had been preparing her to use. The daughters who married without such agreements, who entered the full legal condition of coverture, had to find other ways to exercise the practical authority that their fathers had cultivated in them. The husband's agreement, explicit or implicit, was the primary tool. A husband who recognized and respected his wife's knowledge of the management of the estate, who was willing to defer to her judgment in the areas where her judgment was clearly better than his, could provide the practical framework for the exercise of her capacity, even in the absence of the legal framework that would have provided it automatically. These marriages existed. The historical record contains evidence of them in the letters between husbands and wives that discuss the management of property and investments with a quality of equality that was not the norm of the era, in the accounts that were maintained in ways that reflected the wife's management decisions rather than the husband's, in the testimony of the professional men who worked with these families and who noted, sometimes with surprise, the degree to which the wife was the active manager of the affairs they were nominally managing for the husband. The marriages were, in most cases, not widely advertised as unusual. The legal fiction of the husband's authority was maintained for public purposes, in the correspondence with professional men who were not members of the family, in the social world where the assumption of male authority was part of the atmosphere. The actual management was conducted within the marriage, in the private space of the domestic partnership, and the people who observed it from outside saw the fiction rather than the reality. This was not, in most cases, a source of resentment. The daughters who'd been educated in the study had been educated in a world that required the maintenance of certain fictions, that understood the navigation of social expectation as part of the practical work of managing a life in the world. The maintenance of the legal fiction of the husband's authority was another instance of the navigation that the education had prepared them for. The authority was real. The fiction was what was presented to the world. The difference between the two was managed with the same practical intelligence that managed everything else. The trust instrument was not the only legal tool available for the management of inherited property by a woman who wished to maintain active involvement in that management. The power of attorney was another instrument, one that gave a designated agent the legal authority to act on behalf of the person who granted it, within the scope of the authority specified in the instrument. A woman who granted a carefully drafted power of attorney to a trusted lawyer or to a family member could give that person the specific legal authority to conduct specific transactions on her behalf, while retaining the practical direction of those transactions herself. The power of attorney was a flexible instrument. It could be broad or narrow, could specify the exact actions it authorized, or could provide general authority within a defined scope. A well-drafted power of attorney, prepared by a lawyer who understood both the legal requirements and the practical management situation it was designed to serve, could give the managed property a legal representation that the managing woman could direct without being legally constrained by the coverture doctrine. The combination of the trust, the power of attorney, and the antenuptial agreement, used together in households that had the legal advice and the foresight to put them in place, could create a legal framework within which the educated daughter could exercise real management authority while maintaining the legal fictions that the social world required. The framework was not perfect. It was not the same as the full legal authority that a man in the same position would have had automatically. But it was workable, and the women who worked within it demonstrated repeatedly and across decades that workable was enough. The lawyers who designed these frameworks, the lawyers who took seriously the practical management problem that the educated daughter faced, and who brought their legal creativity to the design of instruments that served her management needs within the constraints of the law, were doing work of considerable practical value. Their names are not prominent in the legal histories of the period. The work they did was the work of the careful practitioner, rather than the work of the celebrated advocate, the work of solving specific practical problems, rather than the work of making arguments that changed the law. But the solutions they designed were real, and the women who used those solutions to manage substantial affairs demonstrated, in the practical results they achieved, that the legal creativity had been worthwhile. There are women in the historical record of the Gilded Age who left traces of themselves that survive, and through those traces it is possible to reconstruct, with the care that historical reconstruction requires, something of what their experience was actually like from the inside. Not the whole experience, and not with perfect accuracy, because historical reconstruction is always partial and always filtered through the biases and the assumptions and the limitations of the record that survives, but enough to form a picture that is more than simply imagination. The letters are the best evidence. When they survive, when they were kept in family archives or found their way into institutional collections that were organized enough to preserve them, the letters of these women give direct access to the texture of their thinking and the specifics of their situations. They are not always dramatic. In fact, they are rarely dramatic because the women who wrote them were not writing for posterity or for effect. They were writing to manage the specific practical situations they were in, and the writing reflects that purpose. There is a letter, in a family archive in a northeastern state, written by a woman named Constance in the 1890s to her deceased father's lawyer. The letter concerns a dispute over the management of a trust that her father had established for her benefit, and that was being administered in ways she believed were contrary to her father's intentions. The letter is written in a hand that is clear and confident, in a prose that is direct without being hostile, and it makes its case with a precision that suggests a person who has thought carefully about the argument before setting it down. The letter does not mention that the writer is a woman managing a situation that women of her era were not supposed to be managing. It does not acknowledge the unusual nature of what it is asking for. It simply makes the legal and financial argument point by point, with the specific references to the trust documents and the specific analysis of the numbers that the argument requires. It is the letter of a person who knows what they are talking about and who expects the person they are writing to deal with the substance of what is being said. This directness is, in itself, historical evidence. It tells us something about who this woman was and how she had been formed that the content of the letter does not explicitly state. A woman who writes to a lawyer in this register in this era is a woman who's been educated to see herself as a person whose arguments deserve to be taken seriously on their merits. She is not deferring, she is not apologizing, she's making a case. The lawyer's response is also in the archive. It is, interestingly, equally direct. It addresses the substance of her argument, agrees with 2 of her 3 main points, and proposes a compromise on the third. The tone of the correspondence is the tone of two people engaged in a professional negotiation, rather than the tone of a man managing the concerns of a woman who does not quite understand what she's involved in. The lawyer is treating her as a party to the negotiation with standing and with genuine authority. This is not the only relationship like this in the historical record, but it is one of the cleaner examples of what was possible when the circumstances aligned, when the father had made careful legal arrangements, when the lawyer involved had the character to honour those arrangements, when the daughter had the knowledge and the presence to engage with the professional world on its own terms. Many situations were less clean. Many involved more resistance, more ambiguity, more of the specific friction that came from the fundamental mismatch between what the daughter was claiming the right to do and what the social world believed she should be doing. The historical record contains these more complicated situations as well, in the form of legal proceedings and family correspondence, and the accounts of contemporaries who observed the situations at some remove. What the record shows, across these varied cases, is a pattern. The daughters who succeeded in managing the inheritances and the enterprises their fathers had left them were, almost without exception, women who had been prepared for the specific challenges they faced. The preparation was not always formal or explicit. It was not always deliberate on the father's part, in the sense of a conscious decision to educate a daughter for a specific future role. But it was real, and it was specific, and it made a difference that was measurable in outcomes. The daughters who had been brought into the study and shown the account books, who had been taken to the manufacturing concern or the railroad office, and introduced to the men who managed the operation, who had been given the habit of asking and being answered when they asked about the business. These daughters had resources when the inheritance came that daughters who had been kept entirely in the social world did not have. Helena Gould, the daughter of Jay Gould, the railroad financier whose reputation for aggressive and not always scrupulous financial tactics had made him one of the most controversial figures of the Gilded Age, received an education in her father's business affairs that was relatively direct for a woman of her era and station. Jay Gould was, in many ways, an unlikely educator of daughters in the arts of finance. He was famously private and famously careful about who he trusted with knowledge of his affairs, but he trusted Helena in the way that men of that era sometimes trusted the women in their own households, in ways they trusted almost no one else. Helena was involved, to a degree that contemporaries noted, in the management of the Gould family's affairs after her father's death in 1892. She worked alongside her brothers in the administration of the estate, and she brought to that work a knowledge of the business and a capacity for the specific analytical thinking it required that her brothers, several of whom had been educated in the formal ways that men of their class and generation were educated, sometimes found difficult to match. The accounts of Helena's role in the Gould family's affairs after Jay Gould's death are not fully detailed in the historical record, because the full detail of who did what in the management of a Gilded Age estate was not typically the kind of thing that the era's record keepers preserved carefully. But the accounts that do survive suggest a woman who was genuinely involved, genuinely capable, and genuinely valued for her involvement by the family members who were in the best position to assess her contribution. The Vanderbilt women offer another perspective. The Vanderbilt family was one of the largest and most publicly visible of the Gilded Age dynasties, and its women have been written about extensively, though not always with attention to the business dimension of their lives. The women of the Vanderbilt family were, in the standard narrative, the social figures, the builders of the great Newport cottages, and the organisers of the famous balls, and the arbiters of the social world that the Vanderbilt name came to define. But some of them also had, or developed, a relationship to the business side of the family's affairs that was more substantial than the standard narrative acknowledges. Alva Vanderbilt, the first wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, was a woman whose social ambitions and social intelligence are well documented. Less documented, but equally real, was her understanding of the financial mechanics of the life she was living and the social position she was building. Alva understood that the social world she was constructing required money, and that money required management, and that the management of the Vanderbilt fortune was something she had opinions about, and, in the years of her marriage, some influence over. The divorce proceedings of 1895, which were among the most publicly discussed legal events of the Gilded Age, revealed that Alva's understanding of the Vanderbilt financial arrangements was detailed and practical. She knew where the money was and how it was structured and what the agreements were. This knowledge was not accidental. She had been paying attention. The pattern of women paying attention to the financial mechanics of their lives in the Gilded Age and in the specific houses of the Gilded Age is more consistent in the historical record than the standard narrative of the era acknowledges. Women were supposed not to understand these things. Many women internalized this expectation and turned their attention elsewhere. But many women paid attention anyway, because the financial mechanics of their lives were, in the most direct sense, the mechanics of their own survival and their children's survival and the preservation of everything they had built. The women who had been explicitly educated in the business world by fathers who had made the deliberate or semi-deliberate decision to include their daughters in the transmission of knowledge were, in this context, occupying one end of a spectrum. At the other end were women who had paid no attention at all and who found themselves, when circumstances required them to engage with the financial world, entirely without the tools for that engagement. Most women in the Gilded Age were somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, which is to say they had paid some attention in some ways and were more capable than they were officially supposed to be, but less capable than the specific challenges of managing an enterprise required. The daughters who had been explicitly educated were thus not unique in kind but unusual in degree. They were women who had been given, systematically and deliberately, the specific knowledge and the specific habits of mind that the specific challenges they would face required. This made them, when the challenges arrived, more effective than the social world expected women to be, and more effective than women who had not received this preparation were able to be. The effectiveness was not always visible. In many cases it operated beneath the official surface of the situation, managed through channels and approaches that allowed the woman to exercise her competence without it being officially registered as what it was. This invisibility was, in some ways, a loss. The women who were most effective were often effective in ways that did not become part of the visible historical record, because the forms through which their effectiveness operated were the informal forms that did not generate the documents that archives preserve. But the effectiveness was real. The enterprises were maintained, the estates were managed, the negotiations were conducted, the decisions were made, and the women who made them, in their quiet, competent, socially impeccable way, were demonstrating something about what was possible that would eventually, over many generations, contribute to the change in what was officially acknowledged as possible. The afternoon light in the offices where some of these negotiations took place was the light of rooms where practical work happened, and it had the quality that practical work produces in the spaces where it is regularly conducted. A kind of purposeful atmosphere, a sense of things being accomplished, of the human will being applied to specific problems and making progress through that application. This was not the light of ceremony or of social performance, it was the light of work. And the women who sat in it were working, not performing working, not gesturing toward working, but actually doing the specific practical things that the management of a Gilded Age estate or enterprise required, writing the letters that needed to be written, reading the accounts that needed to be read, making the decisions that needed to be made, in the light of rooms where work happened, being the people their fathers had prepared them to be. The specific women who appear in the historical record as having been raised with some degree of their father's business education share certain characteristics that are worth enumerating, because the characteristics themselves tell us something about what the education produced and what kinds of women were best positioned to use what it produced. They were, with few exceptions, women who were described by contemporaries as unusually direct. The quality of directness, of saying what one meant with precision, and without the decorative indirection that feminine conversation of the era was expected to employ, appears consistently in the accounts of these women. It was not hostility or aggression. It was the quality of someone who has been trained to think about problems directly, and who applies that training to communication as naturally as to analysis. This quality was sometimes uncomfortable for the people who encountered it. The era's conventions for feminine social intercourse were organized around a degree of indirection that had its own value, the smoothing of social friction, the preservation of the other person's dignity in the face of disagreement, the management of the social temperature in ways that kept it from rising to uncomfortable levels. A woman who was more direct than this convention expected was departing from the convention, and departures from convention attracted attention. But the directness was also, in the specific context where these women most needed to be effective, an asset. In the lawyer's office, in the negotiation with the trustee, in the communication with the business manager about how the accounts should be handled, Directness was more efficient than indirection, and less susceptible to the kinds of misunderstanding that could arise when what was meant had to be inferred from what was said. They were also, these women who read. This sounds trivially obvious, since all women of their class and era were literate and most read to some degree. But the quality of the reading was different. They were readers who read with attention and with purpose, who were looking for specific things in what they read, and who remembered what they found and applied it. The financial pages, the business sections of the newspapers, the annual reports of the companies in which the family had interests, the legal documents that pertained to the estate. These were texts that these women read with the attention of someone who understood what they meant, and who was reading them to inform action, rather than simply to be informed. This purposeful reading was a habit that had been developed through years of being in rooms where the papers that mattered were being read with attention. A daughter who had grown up watching her father read the financial pages with the specific quality of attention that a man reads things that affect decisions he will need to make had absorbed, through that observation, a model of how reading could be done. She was not simply moving her eyes across the page, she was engaging with the text as something that made claims about the world that needed to be assessed and acted on. The purposeful reading habit extended to the reading of people. The same analytical intelligence that was applied to the account books was applied to the men and women with whom these daughters had to deal, and the application produced an unusual accuracy of social assessment. They knew, or could quickly determine, who was trustworthy and who was not, who was managing the situation in good faith, and who was managing it in their own interest, who could be worked with, and who needed to be managed with more caution. This accuracy of social assessment was not unique to daughters who had been educated in business. It was a form of intelligence that many women of the era possessed, developed through the social observation that the social world required. But in combination with the business knowledge, it was more directly useful, because it allowed the woman who possessed it to understand not only what the people around her were doing in the social sense, but what they were doing in the business sense, and to assess the relationship between the two. The women of the Rockefeller family provide one of the better documented examples of this combination. The Rockefeller family was, by the late 19th century, one of the most powerful financial entities in America, and it was also a family that had developed a distinctive culture around the management of money and the transmission of that management to the next generation. The women of the family were not kept outside this culture. They were included in it, in the ways that their specific positions within the family and the era's social conventions allowed. Bessie Rockefeller, the oldest daughter of John D. Rockefeller, married Charles Strong, and created in her marriage a situation that reflected the family's unusual approach to women's engagement with the world of affairs. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable intelligence who was genuinely involved in the management of her own financial affairs, and who brought to that involvement the habits of mind that had been developed in the Rockefeller family culture. The Rockefeller women of the following generation, particularly Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, who married John D. Rockefeller Jr., brought similar qualities to their management of the family's philanthropic enterprises. Abby Rockefeller's founding of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929, in collaboration with two other women of similar background and similar formation, was not primarily a business enterprise, but it required the same qualities of management and resource allocation and relationship navigation that a business enterprise required, and Abby brought to it the competence that her formation had developed. These are the better documented cases, the cases where the women's activities were recorded because they resulted in the creation of institutions that kept records. For every Abby Rockefeller who created a museum, there were dozens of women who managed family estates and business interests with equal competence and whose stories exist, if at all, only in the fragmented private record of letters and account books that have not always survived and have not always been preserved in accessible archives. The dozens are the more important story in a way, because the dozens represent the ordinary operation of the phenomenon, the transmission of business education from father to daughter, happening in household after household, across the upper reaches of American society, producing women who could manage the inheritance they received, and who transmitted to their own daughters the expectation that such management was possible. The letters of the women who managed their affairs in this period contain, here and there, moments of something like frustration, of the particular irritation of a person who is competent being treated as if she were not. The frustration is usually expressed obliquely, in the form of a remark about the behaviour of a particular professional that would not have been made if the behaviour were not worth remarking on. the lawyer who explained something that she already understood, the banker who directed his comments to the husband who happened to be present rather than to the wife who had initiated the meeting, the agent who failed to provide the specific information she had requested and provided instead a general assurance that everything was fine. These moments were not the dominant experience of the women in the record. The dominant experience was the work itself, the daily management of the correspondence and the accounts, and the professional relationships and the decisions that required her attention. The work was absorbing in the way that substantial work is absorbing, in the way that the full engagement of intelligence and knowledge with problems that require both intelligence and knowledge produces a quality of attention that is its own reward, apart from any external recognition of it. But the moments of frustration are worth noting, because they are evidence of the gap between the capacity the education had built and the recognition that the world was prepared to offer. The capacity was real, the recognition was incomplete. The gap between them was the condition in which the work was done, and the work was done in that gap day after day, with the persistence that the education had, among other things, cultivated. Helena Gould, in the years after her father's death in 1892, navigated a world that was prepared to see her as the daughter of Jay Gould, rather than as a person with her own particular capacities and her own particular relationship to the fortune her father had left. The association with her father was inescapable, given the scale of what Jay Gould had built and the particular quality of the reputation he had acquired in the process. The daughter of one of the most controversial financial operators in American history inherited not only the fortune but the reputation, the specific quality of public attention that the Gould name attracted. What is notable in the accounts of Helena Gould's management of her affairs in the years after her father's death is the degree to which she brought to that management a quality of careful, methodical attention that was, in its own way, as remarkable as the more dramatic operations that her father had conducted. Where Jay Gould had operated in the large, with the sweeping gestures of a man who was reshaping the structure of an industry, Helena operated in the specific, with the careful attention to detail that the management of a large and complex inheritance required. The scale was different. The quality of attention was, in its own register, comparable. The women who appear in the record as the daughters of the great Gilded Age fortunes share, across the considerable variation of their individual circumstances, a quality of having absorbed something from the world that built those fortunes that went beyond the material inheritance. They had absorbed the habits of mind of the people who had built the fortunes, the willingness to gather information and evaluate it carefully and make decisions on the basis of that evaluation, the persistence to continue the work even when the conditions were difficult, the practical intelligence that the management of substantial affairs requires. This inheritance of habit and mind was, in some ways, more durable than the material inheritance. The material inheritance was subject to all the vicissitudes of the economic world, to the fluctuations of markets and the changes of law, and the various risks that substantial property always faces. The inheritance of habit and mind was internal, carried in the person who had received it, and it was, within the limits of human capacity, reliable in a way that external fortune was not. The daughters who had received this inheritance used it in the management of their material inheritances, and in that use they demonstrated something about what the education had produced. They demonstrated that the capacity to manage substantial affairs was not inherent in any particular social position or any particular gender, that it was a capacity that could be built through the deliberate cultivation of specific knowledge and specific habits, and that the women who received that cultivation were as capable of using it as anyone else who had received it. The specific women who appear in the archive with the most complete documentation are not always the women whose stories are most representative of the broader pattern. The completeness of the documentation reflects factors that are partly accidental and partly deliberate, the accident of survival combined with the deliberate choices of family members and archivists about what was worth preserving. The women whose papers were preserved most completely were often the women whose activities were most visible in the public record for some reason unrelated to the management of their affairs, women who had made notable philanthropic gifts, or who had been involved in notable social events, or who had family members who valued the preservation of the family's history. The women whose activities were most quietly conducted, whose management of their affairs was most completely invisible to the social world around them, are sometimes the least well documented, precisely because the invisibility that made their management possible also made their documentation incomplete. The archive contains less of them, because they left less in the archive, because their work was the kind of work that does not generate public documentation, that is conducted in the private space of the study, and the correspondence with professionals and the management of relationships that were themselves conducted quietly. This archival invisibility is not the same as historical insignificance. The women who managed their affairs most quietly were not necessarily managing them less well, or managing affairs of less consequence. They were managing in ways that the social world around them did not observe closely enough to document, and their management is recoverable only through the patient work of assembling the evidence that does exist, the letters and the accounts and the legal instruments that are present in the archive but not prominently catalogued, and reading them with the specific attention that reveals what they contain. The history of these women is therefore, in a specific sense, a history that has to be reconstructed rather than simply read. The reconstruction requires the willingness to spend time in archives looking for evidence that is not labelled as what it is, the patience to read correspondence that was written for a specific recipient in a specific context, and that requires that context to be understood, the capacity to see the pattern in the accumulation of specific details that individually seem unremarkable, but that together constitute a picture of a life organised around the active management of substantial affairs. The reward of the reconstruction is the picture itself, the specific and human picture of women who were doing something unusual in an era that did not expect it or support it, who were doing it with the intelligence and the persistence that the education they had received had built in them, and who were doing it in the privacy of their own households and the quiet of the study and the lamp circle, without announcement or credential or public recognition, because the management required to be done and they were the ones who had been prepared to do it. The particular quality of summers in the houses of the very wealthy in the last 2 decades of the 19th century has been written about extensively, because it was in many ways the most visible expression of what Gilded Age wealth had made possible and what Gilded Age wealth required. The great cottages at Newport, misnamed with the characteristic understatement of the very wealthy who were building 70-room mansions and calling them cottages, the rambling houses at Bar Harbor and Lenox and Tuxedo Park, the camps in the Adirondacks where the paradox of roughing it in considerable luxury was enacted with perfect seriousness. All of these summer places had in common a certain quality of suspension, of ordinary life interrupted and replaced by something more elaborate and more consciously performed. For the daughters who had been receiving an unusual education during the school year, in the morning conversations at the breakfast table and the quiet hours in the study, summer had its own character. It was, in one sense, the season of the social world at its most demanding. The Newport cottages were the theatre of the Gilded Age social performance, and they required, during the months when they were occupied, a continuous and exhausting attention to the elaborate protocols of who was visiting whom, and who was appearing at which entertainments and what one wore and when one wore it, and in what company, and the 1,000 other decisions that the social machinery of Newport required its participants to manage simultaneously. The cliff walk at Newport was one of the distinctive features of the place, a 3.5-mile path along the cliffs above the Atlantic Ocean that gave access to the most concentrated display of Gilded Age architectural ambition in America. Walking the cliff walk was an activity that combined the pleasure of the ocean air and the physical beauty of the coast with the social experience of being visible, and visible in the right way, at the right time, in the right company. It was an activity that was simultaneously exercise and performance, which was characteristic of much of what happened at Newport in the summer season. But the cliff walk in the early morning, before the social machinery had assembled itself for the day, was a different thing. In the early morning, when the light was still low and the ocean was grey, and the big houses stood on their lawns above the path in the quiet before they had been opened for the day's activities, the cliff walk had a quality of solitude that was almost impossible to find in the Newport of the afternoon. The ocean was simply itself, without an audience, making it sound against the rocks with the indifference it had always maintained. A father and daughter walking the cliff walk in the early morning, before the household had assembled itself, could talk about the business without anyone overhearing. This was not a trivial advantage in a world where the social implications of a conversation about business being overheard by the wrong person could have consequences for the family's social position. Newport was a place where information moved quickly, and where the implications of what was observed were discussed with great efficiency. The early morning walk provided a space outside the social world's attention, and some fathers took advantage of it. The combination of physical movement and the presence of something as vast and indifferent as the ocean seemed to facilitate a different quality of conversation than the study produced. The study was the place of concentrated attention, of sitting still and looking at papers and working through figures. The walk was the place of thought in motion, of ideas arising and connecting as the body moved through space, of the particular clarity that physical movement can produce in the thinking mind. The summer education was different from the winter education in this respect. In winter, in the city houses, the education happened in rooms, in the specific rooms of the house, and had the quality that rooms produce. In summer, some of it happened outside, in the early morning light and the ocean air, and had a different quality. Not less serious or less substantial, but differently embodied. The same knowledge, being transmitted in a different physical context, producing a different kind of knowing. The houses at Newport were also, in some cases, houses where business happened in parallel with the social season. The men who came to Newport brought their business interests with them, because men of affairs in the Gilded Age did not become men without affairs when they left the city. They continued to receive telegrams and letters, and to conduct negotiations and to make decisions, from the libraries of their cottages or from the club rooms where men gathered to discuss the matters that occupied them regardless of whether they were in the city or at the seashore. The daughters who had been educated in business matters moved through the Newport social world with the double awareness that had characterized their lives in the city. They knew who everyone was in the social sense, which was the knowledge that the social world required them to have, and they also knew, in many cases, who everyone was in the business sense. They understood the relationships between the men who were present at these entertainments, the partnerships and the rivalries, and the particular histories that structured how these men dealt with each other. This double knowledge was useful. It was not always possible to act on it directly, but it informed the way these daughters moved through the social world and the way they managed their own affairs. A woman who understood that the man she was dancing with at a Newport ball had a complicated relationship with her father's railroad interests, who knew the history of that relationship and its current status, was navigating the dance with information that most of the other dancers did not have. She might not be able to use that information in the ballroom, but she was aware of it, and the awareness shaped what she attended to, and what she said, and what she chose not to say. The social world of the summer cottage was, for all its surface formality, a world that generated information. The proximity of the households, the frequency of the social interactions, the relative informality of the summer mode compared to the city mode, all of these produced more openness than the city produced. People said things at Newport that they would not have said in a New York drawing room, because Newport had a slightly different register of formality, a slightly more relaxed relation to the serious business of social performance. The daughters who were paying attention collected what they observed with the patient thoroughness of people who had been taught to pay attention to what the numbers in a ledger were telling them. They were doing the same thing with the social world that they did with the account books. Reading what was there, noting the patterns, drawing conclusions that would be useful when the situations arose that the conclusions could be applied to. This was a form of intelligence that the social world of the Gilded Age valued without always acknowledging. Social intelligence was expected of the women of the class, the ability to read rooms and manage impressions and navigate the elaborate protocols of the calling card and the dinner party and the ballroom. But the use of social intelligence in combination with business knowledge, the application of one to the other in ways that made each more useful, was not something the social world had a category for. The daughters were doing it anyway. The summer cottage world, with its concentration of social and financial power and its slightly relaxed formality, was a particularly good environment in which to develop the combination. The same person who understood the balance sheet also understood the room, and the understanding of the room informed the understanding of the balance sheet and vice versa, in ways that made both understandings more complete. The evenings at Newport, when the formal entertainments of the afternoon had concluded and the household was settling into its nighttime mode, had a quality that was different from the evenings of the city season. The ocean was present in the evening, in a way that was not merely ambient but genuinely influential on the atmosphere. The sound of it, the smell of it, the knowledge of its presence just below the cliff that the houses stood on, gave the evenings at Newport a quality that the city evenings did not have. There is something about proximity to the ocean, particularly in the evening when the social performance of the day has concluded and the household has settled into its quieter rhythms, that produces a particular state of mind. The ocean is large and old and entirely indifferent to the human dramas being enacted above it. Its sound is continuous and rhythmic and conducive to a quality of thought that is neither anxious nor idle, but simply present. For a woman who had spent the day managing the tensions between what she knew and what the world would allow her to do with what she knew, the ocean's indifference to that tension was not trivial. It did not solve the tension. It did not make the social world's assumptions any less constraining or the work of managing them any less demanding, but it provided a kind of perspective, a reminder that the specific human arrangements being navigated were not the whole of reality, that something older and larger than those arrangements existed, and that it went on existing regardless of how the negotiations in the drawing room concluded. The daughters who stood on the piazzas of the Newport cottages in the summer evenings and looked out toward the ocean, while the sounds of the household settling into its nighttime routines came from behind them, and the sound of the ocean came from below, were in a liminal space, between the world of the household and the world of the ocean, between the social self and whatever was underneath the social self, between the performance that the evening was ending and the reality that was simply there, beneath and before any performance. In this space, some of them thought about the work, not the business work, which had its own time and its own kind of thinking, but the larger question of what the work was for and what their lives were for and what it meant to be the kind of person they were, in the kind of world they were in. These were not questions the morning conversation in the study addressed. They were questions the ocean suggested, in its own way, through the simple fact of its presence. The season at Newport ended in September, and the households packed themselves up with the efficiency of long practice and returned to the city, and the city resumed its claims. The social world assembled itself again for its winter operations. The calling cards returned to their rituals, the charitable subscriptions renewed, the dinners resumed. And the daughters, carrying everything they had accumulated over another summer, descended once more into the world that waited for them. The specific landscape of the summer resorts where Gilded Age families spent their summers was as various as the families themselves, and each place had its own character that shaped the experience of spending time there. Newport was one thing, with its cliff walk and its ocean and its concentration of social competition, and its elaborate cottages that made the term cottage seem like one of the better jokes of the era. Bar Harbour was another, a place where the informality of the main woods was maintained even by families who brought their entire households with them when they came, and where the mountains behind the harbour gave the place a different quality from Newport's oceanic exposure. Lennox and Stockbridge in the Berkshires were another register again, the Massachusetts hills producing a kind of New England seriousness, a sense that leisure should be productive, that shaped the culture of the summer colonies there. Tuxedo Park in New York was perhaps the most deliberately engineered of the summer resorts, a planned community with a gate and a guardhouse and a set of social rules that made it in some ways the most controlled social environment of all the Gilded Age summer places. It had been created by Pierre Lorillard, the tobacco heir, in the 1880s, on a large tract of land in the Ramapo Mountains, and it attracted a clientele that was distinguished not only by wealth, but by a particular kind of social seriousness, a conviction that the management of social intercourse was itself an important activity, requiring the full attention of intelligent people. In each of these places, the daughters who were receiving unusual educations were also receiving the education of the specific place. Newport taught the ocean and the cliff walk and the particular kind of social performance that Newport required. Bar Harbour taught the mountains and the harbour, and the somewhat more relaxed version of the social world that Bar Harbour permitted. The Berkshires taught the hills and the farms and the quality of New England summer light that is different from the light of the coast. The physical education of place is not a trivial thing. It shapes the imagination, which shapes the thinking, which shapes the capacity to understand situations and to navigate them. A woman who spent her summers at the ocean had a different set of natural metaphors available to her thinking than a woman who spent her summers in the mountains. The specific physical world of childhood and youth becomes part of the landscape of the mind, available for the rest of a life as a reference point for understanding things that have nothing to do with the physical world itself. The daughters who spent their summers in Newport had the ocean, with its indifference and its power and its constant presence beneath the cliff. It was there in the background of everything that happened in the cottages above it, making it sound and making it smell and being, in the most immediate physical way, a reminder that the elaborate human construction of the social world was small and recent and not eternal. For women who were managing the tension between what they knew and what the world permitted them to do with what they knew, the ocean's indifference to that tension had a specific value. It did not make the tension less real. It did not make the social world's assumptions less constraining. But it provided a perspective, available every morning on the cliff walk and every evening from the piazza, that was genuinely useful for people who needed to sustain their own sense of what was real against the social world's insistence that only certain things were real. The ocean said, without words, "Here is something that existed before the social world and will exist after it. Here is something that does not care about the categories the social world has established for organizing human beings. Here is something that has been doing what it does for longer than any human institution has existed, and that will continue doing it regardless of what the institutions decide." This is not a philosophy. It is not an argument. It is simply the presence of something large and old and indifferent, which provides a context for the human arrangements that happen in its vicinity. The daughters who walked on the cliff walk in the early morning before the social day had assembled itself were walking in the presence of this context, and the presence shaped the thinking that happened in those mornings. The gardens of the summer houses were another kind of education. The gardens of the great Newport cottages were formal gardens, designed by landscape architects according to the principles of the formal European tradition, and they were maintained by gardeners who understood the requirements of formal design and who managed the considerable labour of keeping those requirements met. But in the less formal summer places, and even in the corners of the Newport gardens that were not on the main visual axis of the formal design, there were gardens that were more simply themselves, more responsive to what the place and the climate actually produced, less managed into conformity with an ideal that the plants themselves had no interest in conforming to. A woman who paid attention to a garden over the course of many summers learned something about the difference between what things ideally should be and what things actually are, in the specific conditions of their specific existence. This is not a business lesson exactly, but it is a lesson about the relationship between intention and reality, about the gap between the plan and the execution, about the patient necessity of working with actual conditions rather than against them, that is applicable to business management as well as to garden management. The summer houses themselves, in their physical specificity, were also teachers. The leaking roof that appeared in the second year after the house was built, the damp in the basement that required management every spring, the trees in the garden that grew in directions that blocked the view the house had been built to provide, the roads to the summer place that were muddy in spring and dusty in summer and required constant maintenance to remain passable. These were the practical realities of maintaining large physical properties, and the daughters who grew up in them and eventually managed them were learning, in the management of these physical realities, the same principles of practical administration that the management of the business required. The particular pleasure of the summer houses, for all their complications and all the social performance they required, was real. The pleasure of the specific physical place, the quality of the light and the air, the particular smell of the gardens and the water and the old wood of the house itself, the sound of the family gathered in the evening and the particular quality of that gathering in summer that it did not have in the city. These pleasures were not separate from the education. They were part of it, part of the texture of a life that was being formed, that would carry these specific pleasures forward as the material of memory and imagination for the whole of the life. The specific landscape of the summer resorts where Gilded Age families spent their summers was as various as the families themselves, and each place had its own character that shaped the experience of spending time there. The social geography of the summer colonies was organized, like the social geography of the city, around hierarchies of position and wealth and taste that were legible to the people who moved within them. Who was invited to which houses, whose presence at which events was noted and commented on, who was admitted to the inner circles of the summer colony's social world, and who remained on the periphery. These were questions that the social world of the summer resort attended to with the same serious energy that it brought to the social questions of the city. For the daughters who were managing substantial affairs in addition to participating in the social world of the summer resort, the summer presented a particular management challenge. The social obligations of the summer season were real and pressing. The invitation that could not be declined, the entertainment that had to be returned in kind, the visible participation in the activities of the colony that marked a family as properly engaged with the social world. These obligations did not suspend themselves because the woman who had to meet them was also managing a property portfolio or reviewing the accounts of a trust or corresponding with her lawyers about a pending legal matter. The management of the dual obligation required a kind of time management that was not natural to the social world of the Gilded Age. The social world did not believe in time management in any explicit sense. Time was organized around the social calendar, around the events that were planned and the calls that were made and received and the activities of the summer day. The idea that a woman of her position should be allocating her time in the way that a business person allocated time, with a specific attention to what required how much of it, was not a natural social concept. The daughters who had been educated in the study had absorbed a different relationship to time, a relationship shaped by the practical demands of the work. The work had requirements, the correspondence had to be attended to, the accounts had to be reviewed, the decisions had to be made within the timeframes that the decisions required. Time was not infinitely available, it had to be managed. The cliff walk at Newport, which ran along the shore behind the great cottages from Bailey's Beach to the eastern end of the island, was one of the places where the social world of the summer resort intersected with the natural world in a way that the natural world dominated. The Atlantic Ocean, from the cliff walk, was enormous and indifferent, the waves coming in from the distance with the steady rhythm of the tide and breaking against the rocks, with the sound that had nothing to do with the social season or the dinner parties, or the competition among the cottages that organised so much of the Newport summer. A woman walking the cliff walk in the early morning before the social day had begun was in the company of the ocean rather than the company of her social obligations. The ocean was not asking anything of her. The ocean was simply there, doing what it had always done, moving with the tides and the winds in the patterns that had preceded the Gilded Age by millions of years and would outlast it by the same. The perspective that the ocean offered was not comfort exactly, not the comfortable reassurance that everything was going to be all right. It was something more austere than that. It was the perspective of scale, the reminder that the human concerns that occupied the social world were small against the background of the physical world, that the management decisions and the social obligations and the legal complexities were all occurring within a human world that was, from the ocean's perspective, recent and transient and not especially significant. The daughters who managed their affairs were not on the whole people given to self-dramatization, to the performance of the difficulty of their situations. They managed the situations because the situations required management, and they brought to the management the qualities that the education had built in them. But the early morning on the cliff walk, with the ocean below and the sky above and the social world still asleep in the great cottages behind them, was a space in which the management could be set aside for a while, in which the person who managed could simply be present to the world that did not require her to manage anything at all. The light on the water in the early morning was a different light from the afternoon light that came through the study windows. It was the light of the beginning of the day, the light that had just arrived from the east, low and clear and without the warmth that it would acquire as the day advanced. It moved on the water with the movement of the water, changing as the waves changed, catching the crests and releasing them, never the same for 2 consecutive moments. It was the light of a world that was in motion, that had been in motion before the houses were built, and the social world was organised, and the education in the study was given and received, and that would continue in motion after all of those things were concluded. The great enterprise that a man built in the Gilded Age was not only the enterprise itself, it was also the reputation that surrounded it, the web of relationships that sustained it, the specific social position that made it possible to do business with the people one needed to do business with. In the Gilded Age, these things were inseparable in a way that later eras would attempt to separate, but never fully succeed in separating. The business was the man, and the man was his position in the world, and his position in the world was maintained by the combined effort of his own management of the commercial sphere and his wife's management of the social sphere. When a man died, all of this was disrupted in ways that were not fully captured by the formal legal instruments of inheritance. The will specified who received what in the most literal financial sense. It did not specify how the web of relationships was to be maintained after the death of the person around whom the relationships had been organised. It did not specify how the social position was to be defended in the months and years when the family was adjusting to the changed circumstances of the father's absence. It did not specify how the people who had done business with the father because they trusted the father's specific judgment, who had extended credit or entered agreements on the basis of their assessment of the father as an individual, were to be persuaded to continue those relationships now that the father was gone. This was the situation into which the daughters who had been educated in unusual ways entered when the moment of inheritance arrived. They had the formal claim, whether direct or through a trust arrangement. They had the knowledge their father had given them about the specific enterprise. They had, in many cases, the relationships with the men of affairs who had known their father, and who might, if approached in the right way, be willing to extend those relationships to include the daughter. What they did not have was the automatic authority that the social world granted a man in their position, but did not automatically grant them. They had to earn it, and the earning was not guaranteed, and the earning had to be accomplished in circumstances where the need to earn it was itself a form of disadvantage, because every moment spent establishing authority was a moment not spent exercising it. Some of these transitions went smoothly, at least outwardly. The daughter stepped into the management of the estate with a competence that her father had prepared her for, and the men around her, who had in many cases watched the preparation over the years and who had formed their own assessment of the daughter's capabilities, accepted her management as a natural extension of what had already been occurring in the household. The transition was not invisible, but it was not dramatic. It simply happened, and the enterprise continued. Others were more complicated. The daughter found herself in a situation where the people who were supposed to be administering the estate in her interest had decided in the period between the father's death and the formal settlement of the estate to reinterpret their relationships with the enterprise in ways that did not include her. The trustees who had been appointed to manage the trust in her interest were managing it in ways that seemed to prioritize other interests. The lawyers who had drawn up the documents that were supposed to give her effective control were finding reasons why those documents did not mean what they appeared to mean. The daughter had to defend her position in these circumstances with the tools available to her. The tools were primarily the tools of negotiation, of patient persistence, of strategic deployment of the knowledge she had. She could not walk into a meeting room and assert authority by presence and gender the way a man could. She had to do it through the substance of what she knew and the skill with which she presented that knowledge. This required a particular combination of qualities. She needed to know enough to identify when she was being misled, which required the specific business knowledge her father had given her. She needed to know how to respond to being misled in ways that were effective without being so directly confrontational that they produced resistance rather than accommodation. This required the social intelligence her other education had given her, and she needed the stamina to continue managing these challenges over the months and years it took for the situation to stabilize, which required a quality of determination that was perhaps the most fundamentally her own. The managing of the transition was also, in many of these cases, a matter of managing the perception of the transition. The social world was watching, with the comprehensive and slightly predatory attention that the Gilded Age social world directed at families that were in any way vulnerable. A widow managing an estate was in a conventional and understood position. A daughter managing an estate, with or without a widow mother present, was a more unusual situation, and more likely to attract the kind of attention that translated into commentary. The commentary would not always be hostile. Some of it would be interested, even admiring. But all of it would be evaluative, and the evaluation would be conducted according to standards that the social world had not fully articulated, but that everyone understood. The daughter who was managing the estate was being assessed not only on whether she was managing it well, but on whether she was managing it in a way that conformed to the social world's idea of how a woman of her station should conduct herself. This meant that the management had to be accomplished in a manner that was, on the visible surface, consistent with the social world's expectations. The daughter could not appear to be straining or struggling. She could not appear to be involved in unseemly business conflicts. She could not present herself as a woman fighting for her rights, in terms that the social world would find aggressive or unwomanly. She had to manage the enterprise and defend her position while presenting, to the social world that was watching, the picture of a woman calmly and appropriately attending to her family's affairs. The gap between what this required on the inside and what it produced on the outside was considerable. The inside was the work, the analysis, the negotiation, the strategic thinking, the long patient accumulation of small advantages that would eventually add up to the maintenance of the position her father had prepared her for. The outside was the performance, the calm, the grace, the appropriate appearance in the appropriate places with the appropriate manner. The women who managed this gap successfully were doing something that was technically accomplished and personally costly. Technically accomplished because it required the simultaneous management of two completely different registers of skill and performance. Personally costly because the maintenance of the performance required a continuous suppression of the authentic response to the situation, which was often considerably less calm than the performance suggested. The houses in which these dramas were occurring looked from the outside like the houses they had always been. The social routines continued. The calling cards were left and received. The charitable subscriptions were maintained. The dinners were given and attended. The seasons were observed. The households moved between their city addresses and their summer places as they had always moved. What had changed was happening in the study, and the lawyer's office and the boardroom and the correspondence files. The enterprise was being managed by someone different from the person who had managed it before, and that person was different in a way that the social world found difficult to accommodate without requiring the person herself to manage the accommodation. Some of these daughters managed the accommodation brilliantly. They found ways to exercise their competence that the men around them could accept, ways that preserved the social fiction of male authority while allowing the real authority to reside where the competence actually was. The fiction was maintained, the work was done, the enterprise continued. Others found the accommodation more difficult, or found that the men around them were not interested in the accommodation, were committed to resisting it regardless of the competence she brought to the situation. These daughters had harder transitions and less complete successes, and in some cases the enterprises their fathers had built were in fact managed by the trustees and the lawyers and the business partners, rather than by the daughters who had been educated to manage them. The variety of outcomes reflected the variety of circumstances, the specific legal arrangements, the specific characters of the men involved, the specific social position of the family, the specific economic conditions at the time of the transition. All of these contributed to outcomes that were not predictable simply from the fact of the daughter's education and preparation. What was predictable was that the preparation mattered. The daughters who had been prepared were better positioned than the daughters who had not, regardless of the specific outcome. They had more options, more tools, more ability to assess the situation they were in, and to identify the best available response to it. The preparation did not guarantee success, but it changed the odds. The evening in the houses where these transitions were being navigated had the quality of evenings in which the day's work is not fully concluded. The day's official activities were over, the social performances of the afternoon, and the formal meetings and the correspondence. But the thinking continued, in the quiet of the study, in the review of the day's events and the preparation for what the next day would require. The lamp on the desk cast its specific circle of light. The papers were organized as they needed to be organized. The letters that required responses were identified, and the responses were being formed. Outside the study windows, the sounds of the evening city moved through the air with their constant specific texture. And the daughter at the desk in the lamp's circle of light was doing the work that her father had prepared her for, doing it in the circumstances of a world that was not organized to support her in doing it anyway, with the tools she had, with the patience that the situation required, with the particular kind of courage that sustained, everyday, unglamorous work requires from the person who is doing it. The specific problem of managing the relationships with the professional men who surrounded the Gilded Age estate, the lawyers and the trustees and the business managers and the bankers, was a problem that required a particular combination of qualities to solve well. The qualities were not primarily the qualities of the individual professional relationship, though those mattered. They were the qualities of managing a network, a set of relationships that were not independent of each other, but that were connected in ways that made the management of each one dependent on the management of all the others. A trustee who was resistant to the daughter's authority could make the whole situation more difficult, not only by the specific resistances he offered, but by his attitude, which was visible to the other men in the network and which influenced their own assessments of the situation. A lawyer who was genuinely supportive could be an ally not only in the specific legal matters he handled, but in the broader network, his willingness to acknowledge the daughter's authority visible to others and influential on their own willingness to acknowledge it. Managing this network was the work of the long transition, and it required the patient application of the social intelligence that the social world had developed in these daughters, alongside the business intelligence that their father's education had developed. The social intelligence was about reading relationships and managing them, about understanding what each person in the network needed and providing it in ways that built their cooperation. The business intelligence was about understanding the substance of what was being negotiated and knowing when the network's management of that substance was aligned with or contrary to the family's interests. The specific strategies that were available for managing the resistance of particular individuals in the network were limited by the social conventions of the era and by the legal realities of the specific arrangements. Direct confrontation was available but costly because it damaged the relationship and made future cooperation more difficult. Legal pressure was available in cases where the legal instruments supported it, but legal pressure was expensive and time-consuming and created adversarial relationships that made the day-to-day management more difficult. Patient demonstration of competence was available, and in many cases the most effective strategy in the long run, but it was slow and required sustaining the situation through periods when the demonstration had not yet had its effect. The women who were most successful at this management tended to be women who had also inherited from their fathers a quality of patience that was not merely passive waiting, but active, strategic patience. The patience of someone who understands that the timing of actions matters as much as the actions themselves, who can wait for the right moment to apply pressure because they trust their own assessment of when the moment is right. This quality of strategic patience is not commonly associated with the image of Gilded Age women in the historical imagination. The image is either of passive acceptance, the woman who manages her situation by accommodation, or of dramatic confrontation, the woman who rebels against her constraints. The historical reality in these cases was often something more nuanced, the woman who neither simply accepted nor dramatically confronted, but who managed the situation over time with the specific application of intelligence and patience that the situation required. The letters that document these management situations when they survive show this quality very clearly. The woman writing to a trustee about a specific disagreement over the management of a specific asset is not writing dramatically. She is writing with precise attention to the specific issue, with specific reference to the specific provisions of the trust instrument that are relevant, with specific requests for specific information or specific actions that are framed in the most cooperative possible terms while making absolutely clear what she expects. The tone is neither passive nor aggressive. It is the tone of a capable person managing a situation with the resources available to them. This is not a tone that comes naturally. It is a tone that is developed through practice, through the experience of many such exchanges, through the gradual refinement of a style that is effective in the specific context in which it needs to be effective. The daughters who developed this style had done so through the accumulation of experience, both the formal experience of the business situations and the informal experience of the social world, where the management of tone and the precision of communication were skills that had been practiced from childhood. The houses in which these women conducted this management were the same houses in which the management had been inherited. The study where the morning conversations had taken place was now the study where the letters were written, and the account books were reviewed, and the responses to the trustees' latest proposals were prepared. The room was the same. The papers on the desk were different, because the specific situations were different from the situations that had occupied the desk when the father was alive. But the quality of work being done in the room was the same quality of work, the same application of attention to practical problems, the same patient discipline of thinking through the implications of available choices. The household around the study was different, certainly. The father was gone and the household had rearranged itself around this absence, in the ways that households rearrange themselves after the death of the person who has been their centre. The social world had registered the change and was watching the adjustment with the attention it always gave to families in transition. The staff, reduced perhaps from what it had been, continued the routines that sustained the household's basic operation. And within all of this, the daughter who had been educated for this moment was in the room where the education had been given, doing the work the education had prepared her for. Not with the drama that the situation might seem to call for, not with the visible struggle against constraint that the situation might seem to require, simply doing the work in the steady, daily, patient way that work requires from anyone who is doing it seriously. The specific challenge of establishing credibility with professional men who had not known the father was different from the challenge of maintaining the relationships that the father had built. The maintained relationships rested on the foundation of the existing connection, the professional who had worked with the father and who was willing to extend the working relationship to the daughter on the basis of that prior experience. The new relationship had no such foundation. It required the construction of credibility from the beginning in the specific interaction of the first meeting and the first transaction. The first meeting was important in ways that the subsequent meetings were not, because it established the initial frame through which the professional would see the woman he was meeting. If the first meeting established the frame of an active and informed manager, subsequent interactions would be conducted in that frame. If the first meeting established the frame of a passive beneficiary who needed to be managed rather than a manager who needed to be served, that frame would be harder to displace. The daughters who had been educated in the study understood this, and they prepared for the first meetings with professional men with the same care that they brought to the preparation of any important transaction. They knew the specific matters that would be discussed. They had reviewed the relevant documents. They had formulated the specific questions that they needed answered and the specific positions that they intended to maintain. They had thought about the range of responses they might receive and how they would respond to each. This preparation was not typical of women who came to professional meetings in this era. The professional, meeting a woman about the management of an inherited estate, was accustomed to providing information and receiving deference. The woman who came prepared to have a substantive discussion about the specific matters at hand, who asked the questions that an informed manager would ask and pushed back against the explanations that did not square with what she knew, was unusual, and the unusualness was itself information about who she was and how the professional relationship would need to be conducted. The lawyers who found themselves in these meetings sometimes adjusted well and sometimes did not. The lawyers who adjusted well were the ones who valued competence in their clients, who preferred the client who understood what was being discussed to the client who required everything to be simplified and who might, on the basis of that simplification, make decisions that were not well suited to their actual interests. These lawyers became, over time, genuine professional allies, people whose advice was worth seeking and whose counsel was worth following, because it was being given to someone who could evaluate it. The lawyers who did not adjust well were the ones who found the informed client threatening, whose professional identity required the client to be less knowledgeable than themselves, who interpreted the informed question as a challenge to their authority rather than as evidence of a client who was engaged with the management of her affairs. These lawyers did not, in the long run, serve the daughters well, and the daughters who had been educated in the study were generally able to recognize when the professional relationship was not serving them, and to find the alternative professionals who would serve them better. The bankers occupied a similar spectrum. The banking relationships of the Gilded Age were personal in a way that later banking would not be, conducted between individuals who knew each other, and who conducted their business in the context of a personal relationship that carried obligations of loyalty and good faith on both sides. A woman who managed a substantial relationship with a bank was a customer worth having, and the bankers who understood this were the bankers who were willing to conduct the relationship as it needed to be conducted, with the information and the consultation and the genuine advice that an active manager required. The real estate agents and property managers were the professionals whose accountability was most directly tied to observable results. The condition of the properties they managed was visible. The rents they collected were documented. The maintenance they had or had not arranged was evident in the state of the buildings. A woman who visited her properties and looked at what she found was conducting an evaluation that the property manager knew was being conducted, and the evaluation was one that the records either supported or did not. The daughters who managed real property directly, who walked through buildings and spoke to tenants, and verified that the management reports matched the observable reality, were doing a kind of management that was not typically associated with women of their class. The physical inspection of property, the direct engagement with the material conditions of the assets she owned, was a departure from the social expectation that a woman of wealth managed her affairs through intermediaries rather than through direct engagement. But the inspection was effective. The properties that were being managed well withstood the inspection. The properties that were being managed badly were revealed by it. The daughter who had walked through her properties and seen what was there was a different kind of property owner from the one who had relied on the agent's reports, and the difference was visible in the condition of the properties over time. The network of professional relationships that surrounded a Gilded Age estate was not static. It evolved as the professionals involved aged and retired and were replaced by successors as new legal and financial instruments became available that required new professional expertise, as the specific challenges of managing the estate changed with the changes in the broader economic and legal environment. The management of the network was therefore not only the management of the existing relationships, but the management of the transitions that the evolution of the network required. When a trusted lawyer retired or died, the question of who would replace him was a question of considerable practical significance. The replacement lawyer would need to be brought up to the specific knowledge of the estate's affairs that the departing lawyer had accumulated over years, would need to understand the history of the decisions that had been made and the reasons for them, would need to build the working relationship with the woman who managed the estate that the previous lawyer had built over time. The transition was manageable, but it required work. The daughter who had maintained the records carefully, who had the correspondence and the accounts and the legal instruments organized and accessible, was in a better position to manage these transitions than the daughter who had relied on the lawyer to maintain the institutional memory of the estate. The records were the foundation of the transition, the specific documentation that allowed a new professional to understand quickly what the previous professional had understood over years. The woman who had the records had the foundation. The woman who had to reconstruct the history of the estate's management from the new professional's questions was in a more difficult position. This was one of the practical reasons that the education in the study had emphasized the maintenance of documentation. The father who had taught the daughter to keep careful records had understood, whether he had articulated it explicitly or not, that the records were the foundation of the management's continuity, that the management could be interrupted by the loss of any particular professional relationship, but that the management could be resumed as long as the records were intact and the person who held them understood what they meant. There is a kind of knowing that is carried in the body rather than only in the mind. The particular knowledge of a place, a routine, a set of objects that have been handled for years until the handling is automatic, below the level of conscious attention. The farmer who knows the weather by the quality of the morning air, the feel of it against the skin before the sky has been consciously observed. The carpenter who knows the wood by the sound the saw makes in it, the way the resistance changes as the blade moves through different densities. The cook who knows the bread by the weight of the dough in her hands, by the way it responds to the pressure of her palms. This knowledge does not require formal language to exist or to function. It exists in the practiced gesture, in the accumulated response of a body that has done the same thing many times over many years. The daughters who had been educated in their father's businesses had, in addition to the intellectual knowledge of how the business worked and the analytical habits of mind that the education had produced, this kind of bodily knowledge. The weight of the account book in the hands, the specific heft of ledger pages that have been bound together for years, that have been turned in the same direction by the same hand until the turning is as natural as turning the pages of a novel. The particular resistance of a ledger page as the pen moved across it, the slight drag of the nib against the ruled lines, the smell of the ink and the paper together, the posture of concentration that had been assumed so many times in the same chair at the same desk that it had become automatic, the slight forward lean, the particular angle of the head, the way the hands settled on the desk when the mind was working and the body had found its stillness. This bodily knowledge was not something that could be explained or justified in the language of the social world that surrounded these daughters. It was not the kind of knowledge that appeared in the conversations of drawing rooms or in the formal education that women of their class received. It was the knowledge of a person who had been doing specific physical things in a specific environment for long enough that the environment had become an extension of the person, and the person had become, in some sense, an extension of the environment. The physical world of the Gilded Age house had this quality of knownness for the daughters who had grown up in it and had been given access to more of it than the social world typically allowed. They knew the smell of the study in winter and the smell of it in summer, when the windows were open and the city air came in with its particular urban quality. They knew the exact location of the key to the drawer where the important documents were stored, Not because they had been told where it was, but because they had seen it put there so many times that the knowledge had become part of the house's geography in their minds. They knew the way the afternoon light moved across the desk in October, and how different it was from the afternoon light in April. When these daughters took over the management of the enterprise, this bodily knowledge was part of what they brought to it. The physical ease of a person who knows where everything is, who does not have to search for the tools because the tools have been in the same places long enough that the hands go to them before the mind has formulated the intention. This ease was not merely convenient, it was itself a form of authority. A person who moves through a space with that kind of ease is a person who belongs there, and the people around them feel this without necessarily being able to articulate what they are feeling. The social world of the Gilded Age was also a bodily world, of course. The elaborate ritual of the calling card and the afternoon visit, with its precise choreography of who rang and who answered, and how the card was presented, and how the mistress received and what was said in the first 3 minutes and how the departure was managed, was a form of physical knowledge that existed in the body's mastery of the social form. A woman who had grown up in this world carried its physical grammar in her body as surely as she carried the account book's weight in her hands. She knew how to enter a room, how to greet, how to decline and accept and withdraw, with the fluency of a dancer who has absorbed a vocabulary of movement through years of practice. The two forms of physical knowledge coexisted in these women. They moved through the drawing room and through the study with the ease of long familiarity, because they had spent their lives in both and had been given access to both, and both had become natural to them. The body did not distinguish between the social competence and the business competence. Both were simply things it knew how to do. The transition from the drawing room to the study and back again was not a difficult shift because the body had made that transition so many times that it had become part of the body's ordinary repertoire. There are very few images that survive of these women in the settings that would most directly show this dual competence. The photographic practice of the Gilded Age was formal and static, and governed by the same social conventions that governed everything else. Women were photographed in their social roles, in their best clothes, in the drawing rooms and gardens and formal settings that declared their membership in the social world. Photographs of women at desks reviewing account books or writing business correspondence were not common, because this was not a setting the era thought appropriate for the photographic representation of women of good family. The evidence that survives is in the documents, the letters written in the clear, confident hand of someone who has been writing letters for years and who knows exactly what they want to say, the marginalia in the account books, the small notations in the margins of the pages that show a reader who is not merely reading but thinking, making connections, preparing for conversations about what the numbers meant, the corrections in business correspondence, where a phrase has been crossed out and replaced with a more precise one, the kind of revision that comes from someone who is thinking about how the words will land with the specific person who will receive the letter. These traces are the record of a bodily knowledge at work, the knowledge that exists in the hands and in the habitual gestures of the mind that has been thinking about certain kinds of problems for long enough that the thinking has become physical. The particular physical quality of the work itself, the work of managing an estate or an enterprise in the Gilded Age, was a quality of papers and pens and account books and correspondence and the careful physical management of large quantities of documents. This was an era before typewriters were common in private homes, before the telephone had replaced the letter for most business communication, before the office had developed its modern infrastructure. The work of the business was the work of writing in the most literal physical sense, of sitting at a desk and putting words and figures on paper with a pen. This physical labour was not trivial. The volume of correspondence that a significant Gilded Age estate generated was substantial. The letters required to manage the relationships with lawyers and trustees and business partners and managers. The letters required to keep the social world informed and engaged with the family. The letters required to handle the practical affairs of the household and the properties. All of this represented hours of physical labour each day. The physical management of the documents, the organisation of the files and the correspondence, the tracking of what had been sent and what response was expected and what response had arrived, was its own significant work. The daughters who did this work had the bodily competence for it, because they had been doing it, in various forms, since they were young enough to sit at a desk and hold a pen. The practice of writing had become as natural as the practice of moving through a room and the physical endurance required for the long writing sessions that the work demanded was not something they had to develop when the circumstances required it. It was already there, built into the body through years of practice. The hands that wrote these letters and managed these papers were the same hands that had turned the pages of the account books in the study, the same hands that had learned the weight and the feel of the enterprise's documents over many years of handling them. The body knew what it was doing, and the knowledge was in the body as surely as it was in the mind. Outside the study window, in the evenings when the work had been done for the day, the city made its sounds. The horses on the street below, the calls of vendors, the distant sound of the trains that connected the city to the rest of the continent. All of this came in through the windows in the particular muffled form that the heavy walls of a Gilded Age house produced, close enough to remind the person inside of the larger world's existence, far enough away to not disrupt the concentration of the work. The lamp on the desk cast its light on the papers, the hand moved across the page. The specific physical act of writing, the bodily knowledge of the task, supported the intellectual work of the thinking, the way that a familiar physical environment supports a particular kind of thinking, because the body's comfort in the environment frees the mind for the work the mind is doing. And the work continued, in the lamp's circle of light, in the particular stillness of the late evening in the study, in the specific physical reality of a woman doing work that her body as well as her mind had been prepared to do. The specific physical experience of managing a Gilded Age estate in the years after a father's death included dimensions that are easy to overlook in the abstract account of the legal and social challenges, dimensions that were physical and bodily in ways that the abstract account misses. The physical management of the documents that constituted the estate's record was itself a significant task. The files of correspondence, the bound volumes of account books, the legal instruments in their envelopes, the annual reports of the companies in which the estate had interests, the insurance policies and the mortgage documents and the deeds and the probate records, all of this paper was the physical substance of the estate's history and its ongoing management, and it occupied physical space in the house and required physical management to keep organised and accessible. A woman who had spent years in the study had absorbed the physical organisation of these documents as part of the bodily knowledge of the room. She knew where things were, not because she had a system in her mind, but because she had put them there and retrieved them often enough that their locations were stored in the body rather than in the conscious memory. When she needed a specific document, she did not have to think about where it was. She went to where it was, as naturally as going to the kitchen for water. This physical familiarity with the estate's documents was an advantage that was easy to underestimate. The alternative for a daughter who had not been given access to the study before the father's death was to inherit a collection of documents whose organisation was unknown, whose relationships were unclear, whose significance she had no framework for assessing. The process of establishing the overview of the estate, understanding what existed and where it was and what it meant, would have been a significant undertaking in itself, quite apart from the actual management challenges that would follow. The daughter who had been in the room knew the documents. She had read many of them, or heard them discussed, or seen them prepared. She had a framework for understanding what they meant, because she had been developing that framework through years of presence in the room where the documents were created and used. Her management of the transition began from a position of knowledge rather than from a position of discovery. The physical fact of the desk itself was not trivial. A woman who sat down at the desk where her father had sat, in the chair he had occupied, with the papers before her that had been before him, was inhabiting a physical continuity that had its own quality. It was not comfortable exactly, because the circumstances were not comfortable. The father was dead, and the desk was hers now, and the papers required decisions that were genuinely difficult. But the physical familiarity of the desk and the chair and the room provided a kind of support that a completely unfamiliar physical context would not have provided. The body knows how to be in rooms it has inhabited for years. It knows the angle of the light at different times of day, the draught from the window when the wind is from a particular direction, the specific way the chair settles when a certain posture is assumed. All of this is stored in the body below the level of conscious attention, and it is available as a form of support, of orientation, in circumstances where conscious attention is fully occupied with the demands of the situation. The sense of smell, more than any other sense, carries the memory of places, the smell of the study, the specific combination of paper and leather and wood, and the traces of the cigars the father had smoked, and the particular quality of the light through the windows and the old wool of the curtains was the smell of the education, the smell that had been present through all the morning conversations and all the hours of work in the room. When the daughter sat down at the desk after the father was gone and the room was hers, the smell was still there, and the smell carried, in the way that smells carry, the whole weight of everything that had happened in the room. This was not a sentimental experience, or not only sentimental, it was a practical experience, the experience of being in a space that was familiar, and that carried in its familiarity the whole of the preparation that had happened in it. The preparation was still there, stored in the room and in the body that had been formed in the room, available to be drawn on in the ways that the new situation required. The window from which the father had looked out, the view that had been the background of so many of the morning conversations, was still the window and still the view. If it was autumn, the leaves outside were the leaves of autumn, turning in the specific way that October leaves turn, the colours moving through the trees from the top down as the cold worked its way into the branches. If it was spring, the first green of new leaves was on the same trees, the same restrained beginning that spring always makes before it commits itself fully to the season. The view from the window was the same view it had always been, indifferent to the change that had occurred in the room behind it. The trees did not know that the occupant of the chair had changed. The light did not adjust itself to the new circumstances. Everything outside the window went on as it had always gone on, and the steadiness of its going on was itself a form of context for the changed situation inside the room. The physical act of reading a document carefully, of tracking the logic of an argument or the terms of a condition through the specific language in which it was expressed, was a skill that had been built through practice in the study. The legal documents of the Gilded Age were dense in ways that reflected the specific concerns of the legal tradition that had produced them, full of qualifications and provisos and cross-references, and the particular circumlocutions that legal language used to achieve precision, and reading them well required the ability to hold the overall structure in mind, while attending to the specific language of each provision. The daughters who had been educated to read these documents had developed, over years of practice, the particular reading habit that the documents required. They read slowly, with attention to the specific language rather than to the general sense. They noted the qualifications, they traced the cross-references, they identified the provisions that were operative under the specific conditions of their situations, and the provisions that were operative only under other conditions. They built from the specific language of the document the specific understanding of what the document meant in practice. This reading habit was different from the reading habit cultivated by the social and cultural education that the schools and the finishing establishments of the Gilded Age provided. The social and cultural education valued reading as a source of cultivation and refinement, as the medium through which the great works of literature and history and philosophy were absorbed, and the reading habit it cultivated was a reading habit oriented toward engagement with ideas and characters and narratives. This was a valuable reading habit. It was not the reading habit that legal documents required. The daughters who had both reading habits, who had been cultivated by the social and cultural education and educated by the study, brought to the legal documents a combination that was unusual. They had the discipline to read slowly and with specific attention. They had the cultural formation to recognize when a piece of legal language was particularly elegant or particularly clumsy. They had the intelligence to evaluate what the document meant, and the knowledge to evaluate whether what it meant was what the situation required. The physical handling of the documents was part of the reading, in the sense that it brought the body into the act of attention. The document lay on the desk. The hands held it or turned its pages. The eyes moved across the lines. The body was oriented toward the document with the specific posture of close attention, the slight forward lean, the stillness of a person who is concentrating. This physical orientation was not separate from the mental activity of reading. It was the condition of the mental activity, the physical form in which concentrated attention expressed itself. The writing of responses to what was read was the completion of the act of engagement. The letter to the lawyer, written in response to the legal opinion just received, was the place where the reading became action, where the understanding of what the document said was translated into the specific questions and positions that the situation required. The writing required clarity, the translation of a complex legal understanding into specific language that communicated clearly and precisely what needed to be communicated without ambiguity. The handwriting itself was a physical commitment to the clarity. Each letter formed on the paper was a physical act, requiring the specific control of pen and ink that produced a legible and readable document. The women who wrote clearly wrote with a physical attention to the page that was itself a kind of discipline, the discipline of producing a document that could be read and understood without difficulty by the person who received it. In the evenings, after the social day was complete and the household was settling toward rest, the study or the sitting room where the correspondence was handled became the space of a different kind of attention from the social attention that the day had required. The social attention was outward, oriented toward the people who populated the social world and the obligations and relationships that the social world maintained. The evening attention was inward, oriented toward the documents and the decisions and the assessment of the state of the affairs. The lamp's circle in the evening was the circle of this inward attention. Within it, the documents made their claims, the letters required their responses, the accounts revealed their patterns, the management decisions announced themselves as needing to be made. The woman who worked within the lamp's circle was doing the work that the management of her affairs required, in the specific physical intimacy of the study, with the specific quality of attention that the education in the study had built. Outside the lamp's circle, the house was dark and quiet. The household had retired. The social world was at rest. The practical world was also at rest. The agents and lawyers and bankers and all the various professional relationships that the management required having concluded their work for the day and withdrawn until morning. Within the circle, the work continued, in the quiet and the lamplight, with the specific attention that the work had always required. The evenings in the house where the management work was done had a quality that was different from the evenings in houses where management was conducted entirely by others. There was, in the evening hours of a house where the woman was managing her own affairs, a quality of completion that was available, a sense that the work of the day had been attended to, that the correspondence had been read and responded to, and the accounts had been reviewed, and the decisions that required immediate attention had been made. This sense of completion was not always available. The management of substantial affairs was not a task that could be completed in the sense that a specific project could be completed. There was always more correspondence arriving, always more decisions pending, always more assessments to be made. The work was continuous, sustained by the ongoing nature of the affairs that required it. The sense of completion at the end of a working day was therefore the completion of the day's portion of a continuous task rather than the completion of the task itself. But the day's portion mattered. The correspondence that had arrived that morning had been read and responded to. The accounts that had required review had been reviewed. The letter to the lawyer about the pending property transaction had been written and dispatched. The specific management obligations of the day had been met. Tomorrow would bring its own obligations. But for this evening, with the lamp burning and the quiet of the house around it, the work was done, and the quality of having done it well, of having brought the specific knowledge and the specific attention that the work required to the specific demands of the day, was present in the room with the lamp. The body that had done the work was tired in the particular way that close mental work makes the body tired. Not the physical tiredness of manual labour, but the particular fatigue of sustained concentration, of the long engagement of attention with complex problems that required the full resource of the mind's capacity to navigate. The fatigue was real. It was also, in its own way, satisfying. The fatigue of a person who had worked at full capacity and had done the work well. The end of the Gilded Age did not come on a specific date. It came in the way that eras always come to their ends, gradually and then completely, through the accumulation of changes that seem individually manageable, but that together constitute something irreversible, a shift in the underlying conditions that had made the era possible, a change in the world that the era had been built to inhabit. The income tax, introduced at the federal level in 1913, was the beginning of the formal redistribution of the great Gilded Age fortunes. Before the income tax, the accumulation of wealth had no legal ceiling. A man who built something productive could accumulate the returns of that productivity without any formal obligation to share them with the society that had made the productivity possible, with the workers who had provided the labour that the productivity required, with the infrastructure and the institutions that had made the enterprise possible in the first place. The Gilded Age belief in the absolute right of the successful individual to the full product of his success had produced, in the space of 2 or 3 generations, the most concentrated private wealth that the American Republic had seen. After the income tax, and particularly after the estate taxes that followed and the progressive income tax rates that were eventually established, the great concentrations of wealth began, slowly, to disperse. Not immediately and not completely, because wealth resists dispersion, and the men who possessed it had both the motivation and the resources to slow the legal processes of redistribution. But the direction was set, and over the following decades the direction proved irreversible. For the daughters who had inherited or were managing their father's estates, the income tax was a practical change with practical consequences. The income that had seemed reliably substantial and had sustained a specific level of expenditure, a level calculated to maintain the social position the family occupied, became somewhat less so because some portion of it was now going to the federal government rather than to the maintenance of the household. The social obligations continued even as the financial foundations of those obligations began to shift. The First World War changed other things. The social world of the Gilded Age had been built on a set of assumptions about the permanence and the superiority of the civilization that had produced it, assumptions that the European culture from which the Gilded Age had drawn its models had held with even greater confidence than the American version. The war shattered those assumptions in ways that were not immediately apparent, but that became more apparent as the war receded into the recent past and the full scale of what it had meant began to be absorbed. The cultural consequences of the war were felt in the social world of the Gilded Age daughters in very specific ways. The elaborate social rituals that the Gilded Age had maintained, the calling card systems and the season and the formal protocols of the drawing room visit seemed suddenly not merely old-fashioned but somehow beside the point, as if the war had demonstrated something about the world that made these rituals look like what they were, an attempt to create order and permanence through the enforcement of social convention in a world that had just demonstrated that order and permanence were not available on those terms. The social world did not simply dissolve. Social worlds do not dissolve quickly. The rituals continued, but they continued with less force, less conviction, less of the sense that they were maintaining something that really mattered. The families that had most heavily invested in the social machinery of the Gilded Age found themselves managing an apparatus that was increasingly expensive to maintain and increasingly difficult to justify in the changed atmosphere of the post-war world. The households changed in ways that were both material and cultural. The servant class, which had been the essential infrastructure of the great house's operation, was dissolving. The women and men who had staffed these households found, during and after the war, alternatives that were more attractive in almost every measurable way. Factory work paid comparable wages without the constraint of living in someone else's house, without the loss of independent personal time, without the social subordination that domestic service required. Office work and retail work offered similar advantages. The servant problem, which had been a recurring anxiety in the household management literature of the late 19th century, had become, by the 1920s, a genuine crisis. The daughters who were managing these estates in the 1920s and 30s were managing smaller establishments than their fathers had maintained. The 20 or 30 servants of the Gilded Age household had given way to 5 or 8 or 2. The social events that had required extensive domestic preparation were less frequent, less elaborate, or both. The households that had been monuments to the possibilities of organised domestic labour were becoming something closer to ordinary houses, managed by a reduced staff in a more pragmatic way. This reduction was not only practical but social. The social world that the great Gilded Age household had been constructed to serve was itself changing. The elaborate protocol of the afternoon call, which had required a footman to receive the card and a parlour to receive the caller, was giving way to the telephone call, which required none of this infrastructure. The formal dinner party was being replaced in many cases by smaller and less formal entertainments. The ballroom, which had required 30 servants to prepare and which stood empty 350 days a year, was becoming a room that families used for other purposes or stopped maintaining altogether. For the daughters who had been educated in their father's businesses and who had spent the middle decades of their lives managing those businesses, through the complexities of the income tax and the changing social world, and the dissolution of the servant class, the changed conditions of the 1920s and 30s, represented in some ways a liberation. The social machinery that had required such effort to maintain was no longer requiring as much effort. The conventions that had constrained the exercise of competence in the commercial sphere were not gone, but they were looser, more negotiable, more susceptible to the direct assertion of capacity. The professional world was opening slowly to women of education and means. The suffrage amendment of 1920 was one formal marker of this opening, a legal change that reflected and reinforced the social changes that had been occurring through the preceding decades. The women who'd been educated to understand business could, in the 1920s, move in business circles in ways that the Gilded Age had not permitted. Not freely, not without encountering the residual resistance of social assumptions that change more slowly than laws, but more freely than before. Some of these daughters moved into the new professional spaces that were opening with a relief that reflected the long effort of operating in spaces that had not been designed to include them. The formalization of their roles, the explicit acknowledgement that their participation was legitimate, was not something they needed in order to do the work. They had been doing the work without formal acknowledgement for years. But the acknowledgement had its own value, the value of not having to manage the space between what you were doing and what the world said you were doing. Others found the transition to the changed world disorienting in its own way. The social world that had been so constraining had also been so familiar, and the skills that had been developed in its specific requirements had been real skills that had served real purposes. The dissolution of the social machinery that had required those skills was not only a liberation, it was also a loss of a kind, the loss of a world that had been the world for so long that its disappearance was a form of displacement even for people who had found it constrictive. The houses were quieter, the households were smaller, the days were organised differently, less structured by the social calendar that had previously provided the scaffolding around which everything else was arranged. The mornings that had once been the particular time of the unusual education were now mornings in a house that had no unusual education happening in them, because the education that had been unusual had become, over the decades and the changed conditions, simply what the household did. The daughters managed the estates and conducted the business, and wrote the letters and made the decisions. And while this was not yet entirely ordinary in the larger social world, it was entirely ordinary in the specific households where it had always been happening. The light in the study in the morning was the same light it had always been. The papers were still there. The account books were still there. The work was still the work. What had changed was the degree of difficulty required to do the work, which had been reduced by the slow change of the world towards something that more closely matched the capacity the fathers had perceived in their daughters and had decided to develop. The decade of the 1930s brought its own disruptions, the economic disruptions of the Depression that affected every sector of the economy and every level of society, including the sector and the level where the daughters we are considering had spent their lives. The fortunes that had been reduced by the income tax and the estate tax were reduced further by the collapse of the markets and the failure of the businesses that the markets had sustained. The estates that had survived the transition from the Gilded Age to the post-war world were tested again by the conditions of the Depression decade. The daughters who managed these estates through the Depression did so with the tools they had, which were the same tools their fathers had given them and the same tools they had been using for decades, applied now to circumstances that were more difficult than anything their fathers had anticipated when they had given them the education. The principles of sound management that the morning conversations in the study had transmitted were still the principles. The specific applications required by the specific circumstances of the Depression were different from anything the education had directly addressed. But the capacity to reason from principles to applications was itself part of what had been transmitted, and it was available. The stories of how specific families navigated the Depression are as varied as the families themselves. Some navigated it well, preserving the essential substance of the inheritance through careful management and timely decisions. Some navigated it less well, losing portions of the inheritance to the conditions that were overwhelming entire sectors of the economy. All navigated it under constraints that were genuinely difficult and that required the kind of sustained, unglamorous, daily practical intelligence that the morning conversations in the study had been building for all those years. The houses that survived were quieter than they had ever been. The social world had changed in ways that meant the houses served different purposes than they had been built to serve. The evening light moved through the same windows it had always moved through, but the rooms it moved through were often emptier than they had been, the elaborate furnishings reduced or dispersed, the staffs that had maintained them diminished to a skeleton of their former complexity. And in these quieter houses the work continued. The same basic work that the education had prepared these daughters for, the management of the enterprise and the protection of the family's interests, and the decisions that the ongoing reality of having money and property required someone to make. The circumstances had changed profoundly. The work had not changed in its fundamental nature. The daughters who had been educated as sons were now in the latter part of their lives, managing the long consequences of the decisions their fathers had made and the decisions they themselves had made in response to the changing conditions of the world they had inhabited. They were doing it in houses that were smaller and simpler than the houses in which the education had taken place. They were doing it without the social machinery that had been such an elaborate and demanding part of their earlier lives. They were doing it with a freedom that was partly the freedom of the changed social world, and partly the freedom of having reached a stage of life at which the social world's most demanding expectations had been largely fulfilled. The mornings in these quieter houses had a different quality from the mornings of the Gilded Age households. They were simpler, less structured, less managed. There were fewer people to manage the management, which meant that the daughters who had once been the intelligent centre of an elaborate household apparatus were now more directly involved in the practical management of ordinary life than their father's generation would have found appropriate for women of their station. This directness was, in its way, a completion of the education. The woman who had been educated to understand the enterprise was now managing, without intermediary, the direct practical substance of daily life, and the same capacities that the enterprise required were the capacities that the direct management of daily life required. The light in the mornings was the same light it had always been, patient and unhurried, coming through whatever windows were available, touching everything equally. The Depression of the 1930s tested the inheritance that the daughters of the Gilded Age had spent their lives managing, in ways that the original education had not prepared for specifically, but that the habits of mind the education had produced were, in many cases, sufficient to navigate. The habits of mind that were most useful in the Depression conditions were the habits of clear-eyed assessment without panic, of distinguishing between what was actually happening and what the fear and uncertainty of the moment were suggesting was happening, of making decisions on the basis of the available evidence rather than on the basis of the anxiety that the conditions generated. These were habits that the morning conversations in the study had developed through the accumulated experience of looking at numbers honestly, without wishful thinking, and drawing conclusions from what the numbers actually said. The Depression was a period when many people lost their capacity for this kind of clear-eyed assessment, because the fear of what was happening overwhelmed the capacity to think clearly about what was happening and what to do about it. Banks panicked and made decisions that made the situation worse. Investors sold at the worst possible moment because the fear of further losses overwhelmed the analysis that would have told them that selling at that moment was the worst possible response. Businesses contracted in ways that damaged their long-term viability in order to manage short-term pressures that could have been managed differently. The daughters who had been educated in the steady application of analytical intelligence to practical financial problems were not immune to the fear that the Depression generated. They were human beings in the midst of a genuinely frightening economic disaster, and fear is a reasonable response to genuine danger. But they had, in many cases, a capacity for managing the fear and the analysis simultaneously, for conducting the analytical work even in the presence of the fear that people without this specific formation were less likely to have. The account books still told the truth. The numbers still said what they said. The decisions still needed to be made on the basis of what the numbers said, not on the basis of what the fear suggested the numbers might come to say in the worst possible scenario. The specific discipline of looking at the numbers clearly and drawing conclusions honestly from what they said, rather than from what one was afraid they meant, was a discipline that the morning education had developed and that the Depression conditions made directly valuable. The specific management decisions that the Depression required were of a different character from the management decisions of the ordinary course of the estate's life. They were decisions about what to sell and when, about which assets could be held through the crisis and which needed to be liquidated before their value declined further, about how to manage the reduced income in ways that preserved the essential substance of the inheritance, while adjusting the expenditure pattern to the changed conditions. These decisions required the same analytical intelligence that the normal course of management required, applied now to conditions that were more extreme and that left less margin for error. A wrong decision in the ordinary course of business management was costly but survivable. A wrong decision in the Depression conditions could be permanently damaging, eliminating the margin that allowed recovery from further wrong decisions. The women who navigated these conditions successfully did so through the specific application of what their education had given them, in circumstances that tested it more severely than anything the education had specifically anticipated. This was the deepest test of the education's value, the test of whether what had been transmitted was the specific knowledge of specific conditions or the more general capacity to reason well about financial problems regardless of the specific conditions. The women who had received the deeper transmission were better positioned for this test, because the specific conditions were unprecedented, but the principles of sound financial management were not. The houses where this management occurred were, in many cases, houses that were being managed with greater austerity than they had been managed in the years before the Depression. The staff was smaller. The entertaining was less frequent and less elaborate. The maintenance expenditure that the great old houses required was being deferred in ways that would have been unacceptable in the years when the income was more generous. The houses that had been symbols of permanence and solidity were revealing, in the Depression conditions, their dependence on the income stream that the change conditions had reduced. Some of these houses did not survive the Depression intact. The combination of reduced income, deferred maintenance, and the changed social world that no longer placed the same value on the kind of life these houses represented made some of them unsustainable as private residences. They were sold, or donated, or converted to institutional use, or simply closed and left to the slow deterioration that unoccupied buildings undergo. The daughters who managed these transitions managed them with the same quality of patient practical intelligence that had characterized their management of the estate throughout. The house was a physical asset, one of many physical assets in the estate, and its value and its costs needed to be assessed as honestly as the value and costs of any other asset. Sentiment was real, and the sentiment attached to the house where the education had occurred, where the father had been, where the morning conversations had happened, was real sentiment, but sentiment could not substitute for the analysis of whether the house could be maintained and to what purpose. Some kept the houses, some sold them. Some found ways to maintain them in reduced circumstances that preserved the essential connection to the place, without requiring the full expenditure that the place in its prime had demanded. Each decision was the specific decision of a specific situation, made by a specific person with specific resources and specific attachments, and specific assessments of what mattered most. The houses that survived in their various forms are still standing in some cases, monuments to the era that built them, now separated by several generations from the lives that gave them their specific meaning. The studies where the morning conversations happened have been repainted and refurnished and converted to other uses. The account books are in archives or are gone. The specific texture of the work that happened in those rooms is available only through the fragmented record that has been assembled here, through the letters and the legal documents and the private journals and the accounts of people who knew these women and who preserved something of what they knew. The texture of that work was, in the end, the texture of any good work, carefully and honestly and patiently done in circumstances that were genuinely difficult. It was not heroic in the dramatic sense. It was heroic in the ordinary sense, the sense in which any person who does their best work in difficult conditions, without recognition and without drama, over the whole course of a life, is doing something that deserves to be called by that name. The women who managed their inherited fortunes through the transition from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era, and from the Progressive Era through the First World War and into the 1920s, were managing through one of the most rapid sequences of social and economic change in American history. The world that they had been prepared to manage, the world of the Gilded Age study and the Gilded Age social round, and the Gilded Age legal structures, was changing at a pace that the education in the study had not been designed to anticipate. The income tax, when it came in 1913, required the creation of new documentation systems, the adjustment of the accounting practices that had been standard in the pre-war years to the new requirements of a government that wanted to know, in systematic detail, how much income the estate had generated and from what sources. The daughters who had been managing their accounts carefully, who had maintained the documentation that the careful management of property and investment required, were better positioned than the daughters who had managed informally, because the documentation that the tax authority required was documentation that the careful manager had already been maintaining for her own purposes. The war years brought the specific challenge of managing assets in a wartime economy. The inflation of the war years affected the real estate values that were the foundation of many of the inherited fortunes. The labour shortages of the war years affected the household management that was the visible face of the fortune's maintenance. The social expectations of the war years changed, as conspicuous display became less acceptable in a country that was mobilising for the demands of war, and the management of the social dimension of the inheritance required adjustment to the new expectations. The 1920s brought a different set of challenges. The return to prosperity after the war, the expansion of the economy in the early and middle 20s, the particular quality of social energy that the decade generated, all of these created an environment in which the management of an inherited fortune required navigating a world that was different from the world of the Gilded Age in specific and significant ways. The social world of the 1920s was more fluid than the social world of the Gilded Age. The rigidities of the old social order were loosening. The 400, the specific number of people who Mrs. Astor had determined constituted the inner circle of New York society, was no longer the organizing principle of the social world. New money was entering the social world from new sources, from the expansion of industry and finance that the war and the post-war boom had generated, and the old families who had defined the social world of the Gilded Age found themselves in a more complicated relationship to a social world that no longer quite belonged to them. For the daughters who had been managing their affairs since their fathers' deaths in the Gilded Age or the Progressive Era, the 1920s were a period of consolidation, of managing through the changes in the social and economic world while maintaining the core of what the inheritance represented. The estates had survived the war and the inflation and the legal and social changes of the Progressive Era. The management that had carried them through those challenges would need to continue through the different challenges of the 20s. The servants who had staffed the great houses of the Gilded Age were, in the 20s, a different and smaller group. The expansion of the labour market in the manufacturing and commercial sectors of the economy had given domestic workers alternatives to domestic service, and the wages and conditions that domestic service offered were not always competitive with the alternatives. The women who had grown up in the great households of the Gilded Age, accustomed to the management of large staffs, found themselves managing smaller staffs with different expectations and different relationships to the work. The household that had employed 20 in the Gilded Age employed 7 or 8 in the 20s. The specific domestic arrangements that the Gilded Age had required, the elaborate systems of specialised service that the great households had maintained, were simplified into more flexible arrangements in which a smaller staff performed a wider range of functions. The management of this transition was itself a management challenge, requiring the practical intelligence to see what was actually necessary and what was merely customary, to distinguish between the service that maintained the household's functioning and the service that maintained the household's image. The daughters who made this distinction well were the daughters who had been educated to think practically about what things cost and what they were worth. The elaborate service of the Gilded Age household had been worth its cost when the conditions that had produced it were in place. When the conditions changed, the practical intelligence that the education had built was the intelligence that recognized the change and responded to it without being overwhelmed by attachment to the arrangements that the change had made unsustainable. The historical record as it pertains to these women, and to the unusual educations they received and the unusual lives those educations produced, is incomplete in ways that are not accidental, and that are not simply the product of time and its ordinary losses. The incompleteness reflects the social world's habits of attention, its decisions about what was worth preserving and what was not, its determination of what constituted the important record of an era and what constituted the peripheral or the invisible. A world that did not officially acknowledge women's participation in the commercial sphere did not, in the main, create and preserve records of that participation. The formal records, the company documents and the legal instruments, and the official correspondence of the enterprises went to the men who officially held the positions because the men officially held the positions. The informal contributions, the advice given in evening conversations, the decisions shaped by the understanding of someone who was not formally at the table, but whose understanding of the business was shaping what happened at the table, the negotiations conducted from the position of someone who had the competence but not the official authority, these left fewer traces. What does survive, when it survives, tends to be the record of moments when the informal became formal, when the arrangement could no longer be conducted through unofficial channels and required official acknowledgement. The legal moments, the court documents and the trust instruments, and the probate records and the occasional business correspondence that found its way into family archives that were eventually donated to institutions, these are where the women appear most clearly. The informal record is more fragmentary, dependent on the survival of personal correspondence and private journals, and the accounts of people who knew these women and who preserved something of what they knew in their own records. The picture that emerges from all of this is not a simple one, and it is not a complete one, but it is enough to form a genuine account of what these women's lives were like, not in the sense of a definitive historical narrative, but in the sense of a reconstruction that is honest about what it knows, and what it is inferring, and what it simply cannot know. What it knows, most confidently, is the fact of the education. The evidence that certain daughters of certain Gilded Age families received an education in the management of their father's enterprises is clear and consistent across multiple types of evidence, from the letters these women wrote to the legal documents that recorded their subsequent management of those enterprises, to the accounts of contemporaries who noted the unusual nature of the situation. The education happened. It was real. It produced real competence. What it can infer, from the evidence that survives and the patterns it reveals, is something about what the education was like and how it produced what it produced. The morning conversations in the study, the visits to the manufacturing concern or the office, the habit of asking and being answered, the accumulated years of attention to the account books and the business correspondence. These are the components of the education that the evidence suggests were most important. What it cannot fully know is what all of this felt like from the inside. The internal experience of being a woman in the Gilded Age, who had been educated for a role that the world said you should not have, of carrying knowledge that the world said you should not carry, of being capable of things that the world insisted women were not capable of. This experience is recoverable only in fragments, through the private correspondence and the occasional private journal that survived and was preserved and is accessible. The fragments suggest something that is worth attending to. They suggest that the experience was complicated in ways that a simpler narrative of constraint and resistance would miss. It was not simply that these women were capable and were prevented from fully exercising their capability, and were frustrated by this prevention. Some of them were frustrated, and the frustration appears in the private record where it can appear, in the letters written to trusted correspondents, in the private assessments of situations where the gap between what they could do and what they were being permitted to do was most acute. But the record also suggests something else. It suggests that many of these women found, in the specific lives they were able to live, genuine satisfaction and genuine meaning. The work of managing an estate, even from the constrained position of someone who had to manage it through unofficial channels, was real work that produced real results. The preservation of an enterprise that their fathers had built, the maintenance of financial security for themselves and their families, the specific satisfaction of understanding a complex situation and managing it well, these were genuine sources of satisfaction, regardless of whether the official world acknowledged what they were doing. This is perhaps the most important thing about these women that the historical record can recover. They were not simply victims of the social world's assumptions about gender. They were agents, operating under real constraints but operating nonetheless, making real decisions that had real consequences, building real competence that was genuinely applied. The constraints were real, and they were costly, and they limited what was possible in ways that should not be minimized. But within the constraints, something was accomplished that was worth accomplishing. The something that was accomplished included, as has been noted, the preservation of specific enterprises and estates. It included the demonstration, in specific lived lives, that women could manage these things competently, and that the assumptions underlying the social world's resistance to women's management were simply wrong. It included the transmission of knowledge and expectation to the next generation. The daughters and granddaughters who were raised in households where women's competence in business matters was taken for granted because they had grown up seeing it taken for granted. This transmission was perhaps the most consequential thing these women did, even if it was also the least visible. A grandmother who managed the family estate competently was creating for her granddaughter a world in which women managing estates was ordinary, not heroic, not unusual, not in need of special explanation or justification, simply the way things were in the family, the way they had always been, the way they would continue to be. The granddaughter who grew up in this world had a different sense of what was possible for her than a granddaughter who grew up in a world where women's competence in business was always being questioned and always requiring demonstration. She had a baseline expectation of her own capacity that came from the simple fact of having seen capacity exercised by the women around her without drama or special effort. This change in baseline expectations, accumulated across multiple generations, is one of the ways that historical change actually happens. Not through dramatic confrontations or formal declarations, though these have their place, but through the quiet accumulation of demonstrated competence in the ordinary lives of specific people, building over time into a world where what once required special justification is simply assumed. The Gilded Age daughters who were raised as sons, or who were given some portion of the education that sons received, were part of this accumulation. They were not the only part, and they were operating in the specific context of their era and their class, which limited what they could demonstrate and to whom. But what they demonstrated was real, and it added to the record that the next generation could draw on. The houses in which they lived their lives are, in many cases, still standing, though serving different purposes than the ones for which they were built. The great Newport cottages have become museums, and the tourists who walk through them can see the rooms where these daughters grew up, and the rooms where the morning conversations happened, and the studies and the libraries and all the rest of the physical world that contained these lives. What the tourist cannot see, or cannot see without being told to look for it, is the invisible history that the rooms contain. The history of the educations that happened in them. The history of the women who moved between the parlour and the study with the ease of people who belonged in both. The history of the unusual competence that was built in these rooms over many years of patient attention, and the patient willingness of certain fathers to teach what they knew to the children who had the capacity to learn it. This invisible history is part of the history of the houses. It is part of the history of the Gilded Age, and the part of the history of America that the Gilded Age represents. It is part of the history of what it has meant, across the generations, to be a woman in a world that consistently underestimates what women are capable of, and to respond to that underestimation not with declaration or confrontation, but with the quiet, sustained, daily demonstration of the thing itself. The thing itself was competence. The demonstration was a life. And the life, lived in the specific houses and the specific times and the specific circumstances that have been the subject of this story, was real. The light that moved through the windows of the study in the morning was real light. The papers on the desk were real papers. The numbers in the account books were real numbers. The decisions made in the lamp's circle of light at the end of the working day were real decisions with real consequences. The women who made them were real women, not symbols, not representatives of a category. People with specific names and specific lives and specific ways of holding a pen and specific ways of reading a room and the specific pleasure that comes from understanding a complex thing well enough to act on that understanding. They are worth remembering. They are worth knowing about, not because they were extraordinary in the dramatic sense of the word, but because they were extraordinary in the quiet sense, the sense in which ordinary competence consistently and patiently applied to difficult circumstances over the whole course of a life is a form of achievement that does not always receive the acknowledgement it deserves. The morning light is still there. The rooms are still there, even if they are different rooms now, in different houses, inhabited by different people doing different work. The quality of early morning light in an old house has not changed since the Gilded Age. It still moves through the windows slowly, thickening as the morning advances. It still touches everything with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. Let it be quiet now. Let the story settle. The work has been done and the work is done. The morning will come again, as it always comes, with its specific quality of beginning, its particular freshness, its suggestion that whatever the day requires will be met with what the day has given. For tonight, let the light be still. Let the papers rest on the desk. Let the houses settle into their quiet. Let the names and the lives and the long accumulation of demonstrated competence rest in the silence that all stories eventually come to. It is enough. What the daughters of the Gilded Age who were raised with some portion of their father's education in business management left behind them in the long view is a set of lives that demonstrated something about what was possible. The demonstration was not announced as such. It was not offered as evidence for a principle. It was simply lived, in the specific circumstances of specific lives with the specific tools those lives had provided. The principle the lives demonstrated was a simple one, that the capacity to manage complex financial and business affairs was not a gendered capacity, that a daughter, given access to the same education and the same habits of analytical thinking that a son would have received, would develop the same capacity, that the assumption underlying the social world's organization of the commercial sphere, the assumption that men were naturally suited for it and women were not, was simply wrong. This was not a principle that the Gilded Age was ready to acknowledge officially. The social world's resistance to acknowledging it was too strong and too deeply embedded to yield to the evidence of specific individual lives, however clearly those lives made the case. The acknowledgement would come gradually, through the accumulation of many more individual demonstrations over many more decades, through the legal and political changes that eventually modified the formal structures of exclusion, through the cultural changes that eventually modified the informal structures. But the individual demonstrations contributed to the accumulation. They were part of the record that the next generation could draw on, consciously or unconsciously, in its own engagement with the question of what women were capable of. They were part of the heir of certain families, the transmitted expectation that women in the family had always managed these things, and that there was nothing unusual about a woman managing them. The daughters of these daughters, growing up in families where the expectation of female competence in business affairs was simply the family's normal, had a different relationship to the question of what women could do than daughters who grew up in families where the question had never been answered affirmatively. They did not have to demonstrate the possibility from the beginning. They inherited a context in which the possibility had already been established, and their work was to continue it rather than to create it. This inheritance of context is one of the most important and least visible forms of historical transmission. It does not appear in documents the way that legal changes appear in documents. It does not announce itself the way that political changes announce themselves. It simply persists in the specific culture of specific families and communities, available to the people who grow up in those families and communities as a resource for their own negotiation with the social world's expectations. The granddaughters and great-granddaughters of the Gilded Age daughters who were raised as sons are in many cases people living in the world that those early lives helped to make possible. They live in a world where the question of whether women can manage business enterprises is no longer seriously asked, where the formal structures of exclusion have been largely dismantled, where the informal structures are still present but are contested and declining rather than dominant and self-evident. This world did not arrive through any single cause. The suffrage movement, the legal changes of the 20th century, the economic changes of the two world wars, the cultural changes of the 1960s and 70s, all of these contributed to the changed world. The specific lives of the Gilded Age daughters who were educated in their fathers' businesses were one small part of the broader cause. But small parts accumulate. The demonstration that something is possible, made clearly enough in enough specific cases, eventually changes the general assessment of what is possible. The Gilded Age daughters who managed their estates and conducted their business and wrote their precise, confident letters to their lawyers, who sat at the desks where their fathers had sat and applied to the work of managing the inheritance, the same analytical intelligence that the fathers had applied to the work of creating it, were adding their evidence to this accumulation. The accumulation is ongoing. The question of what women are capable of is not fully settled in any human society, and the evidence for the answer continues to be produced and to matter. But the direction is set, and the direction is clear, and the Gilded Age daughters who were raised in some measure as sons are part of the reason that the direction is what it is. The morning light in the old houses is still the same, patient and unhurried, coming through the tall windows in the particular way that light comes through tall windows, illuminating the dust in the air and the surfaces of the objects in the room with the even-handedness that is the most characteristic quality of morning light. It does not distinguish. It does not choose what to illuminate and what to leave in shadow. It falls on everything equally, the account books and the calling cards and the letters and the photographs and all the accumulated evidence of lives being lived in the rooms it enters. Let it fall on everything now. Let it be equal and patient. Let the dust move through it slowly, without hurry, carried by the small currents of air that move through old rooms at certain hours. The story has been told. The morning has been visited, and the afternoon and the evening, and all the seasons of the years that these lives occupied. The houses have been entered, and the rooms have been walked through, and the work that happened in them has been described as carefully as the record allows. What remains, after all of this, is what always remains after a story has been told: the quiet that follows the telling, the settling that happens when a narrative has reached its end, and the reader or the listener is returned to their own time and their own circumstances, carrying whatever of the story will stay with them. Carry what you will. Leave what does not need to come with you. The morning will be the same morning it always is, and the work of your own day will be waiting when the morning comes. But for now, let the story be still. Let the houses settle into their quiet. Let the morning light do what morning light does, which is to illuminate everything equally and without preference, and then, as the morning advances, to change. The archives where the papers of these women have been deposited are, in many cases, the archives of the families and institutions that organise the collection and donation of the papers, rather than the archives that the women themselves would have chosen. The organisation of the papers reflects the categories and priorities of the people who did the organising, and those categories and priorities were not always the categories and priorities that would best illuminate what the women had actually done. A collection organised around the family's public philanthropic activities, for instance, will contain the correspondence about philanthropic projects and the documentation of the grants made and the institution supported, because these were the activities that the family wanted to be remembered for, and that the archives were organised to preserve. The business correspondence of the same woman, the letters to her lawyers and her bankers and her property agents, will be present in the collection, but it may be buried in the correspondence files under categories like personal and miscellaneous, rather than identified as business correspondence and organised accordingly. The researcher who approaches these archives looking for evidence of the women's management activities has to know to look for the evidence in the wrong places, in the files that the organisers did not think of as management records, in the correspondence that was categorised as personal because the woman who wrote it was a woman, and therefore presumed to have a personal rather than a professional relationship with the lawyers and bankers who received the letters. This is the specific kind of historical invisibility that affects the women we are considering, not the invisibility of the destroyed record, but the invisibility of the misfiled record, the record that is present in the archive but has been placed in a category that does not announce what it contains. The investigator who knows what to look for can find it. The investigator who approaches the archive with the assumption that the business management was conducted by the men can miss it entirely, can walk past the files that contain the evidence of the women's management without recognising them as evidence. The oral tradition within families was another carrier of the memory of these women's activities, and the oral tradition was subject to its own kind of loss, the loss of the spoken word that is not written down, and that depends for its survival on the continuous chain of transmission from person to person across the generations. A grandmother might have told her granddaughter about her own grandmother's management of the family's affairs, a story passed down in the family as an instance of competence and practical intelligence. The granddaughter might have told her own daughter. The daughter might have told her children. At any point in the chain, the story might have been lost not to destruction, but to the ordinary interruptions of transmission. The death of the carrier of the story before the transmission was completed, the distraction of the next generation by other concerns, the gradual simplification of the story until it lost the specific content that made it evidence of anything in particular. The generational transmission of the expectation of competence was perhaps more durable than the transmission of the specific stories. The daughters of the daughters who had been educated in the study grew up in households where competence in the management of practical affairs was an expectation rather than an exception, where the model of the managing woman was present in the form of the mother rather than in the form of an abstraction or an aspiration. The expectation did not always produce the specific education that the grandfather had provided. The conditions that had produced the original education were not always replicable. But the expectation remained, the sense that women in this family managed their affairs and did so competently, and the expectation shaped the choices and the self-conceptions of the women who grew up with it. The 20th century changed the conditions in which the expectation had to be realised. The legal barriers that had made the management of inherited property so complicated for women of the Gilded Age were being dismantled, gradually and then more rapidly, through the legislative and judicial changes of the Progressive era and the decades that followed. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, gave women the vote, and with it a formal recognition of political personhood that had not previously existed. The legal and social changes that continued through the 20s and 30s further expanded the legal capacity of women to manage their own affairs. The daughters of the daughters who had been educated in the study inherited a world in which the management of their affairs was legally less complicated than it had been for their grandmothers. The specific strategies that the grandmothers had developed for navigating the legal constraints of coverture were no longer necessary. The professional men who managed the estate's affairs were more accustomed to women who were active managers. The social world was, within limits, more accepting of the managing woman. But the expansion of the legal and social space was not the same as the provision of the education that the expansion made it possible to use. The legal capacity to manage substantial affairs was one thing. The specific knowledge and the specific habits of mind that the management required were another. The daughters who had been given their father's educations had both. The daughters who had inherited the expectation of competence, but not the education that filled it with content, faced the expanded legal space with varying degrees of preparation. This is why the history of the women who were educated in the study matters, not as a history of exceptional women in exceptional circumstances, but as a history of what deliberate, systematic cultivation of specific knowledge and specific habits of mind produced in the people who received it. The cultivation was unusual in its time. The results it produced were, in their own quiet way, remarkable. And the record of those results, partial and incomplete as it is evidence of what was possible when the assumptions that limited the education were set aside, when the practical requirements of the situation were allowed to determine who received the education that the situation required. The quietness of the lives these women lived was not the quietness of emptiness or resignation. It was the quietness of full occupation, of attention fully engaged with the work at hand, of the specific and continuous management of the affairs that required it. The social world around them was sometimes loud, sometimes demanding, sometimes imposing in ways that the management had to accommodate without being disrupted. The management continued through the noise, in the morning hours before the noise began and in the evening hours after it had subsided, in the particular quality of attention that the lamp circle represented, in the work that was always there and that the education had prepared them to do well. The houses are quiet now. The work is done. The light moves across the floor of the old study in the patient way that light has in rooms that have been worked in and loved and left, and it illuminates nothing in particular and everything at once, the surfaces that the work touched and the air that the conversations moved through, and the quiet itself, which is the residue of all the attention that was once given here and that has not entirely departed. The houses are quiet now. The morning conversations that formed these women have long since ended. The account books are in archives somewhere, if they survived at all. The fathers who decided, without quite deciding, to teach their daughters what they knew are long gone. The daughters who sat in the chair across the desk and learned what the numbers meant are long gone as well. What remains is the residue of what they did with what they learned, the traces in the record of a capacity that was built in private and exercised in the spaces that the social world allowed. The afternoon light is moving across the floor of the empty study. It comes in through the tall windows in the slow way that light has in old rooms, thickening as it approaches the desk, pooling around the brass inkwell and the glass paperweight, and the ledger that lies open on the surface. The ledger is still open. Someone has been reading it. The columns of figures are clear and precise, the handwriting careful, the additions checked. The management has been attended to. Outside the window, the street continues. The city continues. The world goes about its business in the way it always does, indifferent to the particular histories that have unfolded in the rooms behind these windows. The carriages have been replaced by automobiles. The gas lights have been replaced by electric lights. The social world that organized the Gilded Age has been replaced by other social worlds with other organizations. The legal world has changed. The economic world has changed. The role of women in both has changed, in ways that are real and significant, even if the changes have been slower and more partial than the women who needed them might have wished. What has not changed is the particular quality of the afternoon light. It comes through the tall windows with the same patient thickening, settles over the same surfaces, moves across the same floors. The dust moves through it, barely visible. The house breathes between its human activities, holding the memory of what happened in its rooms, the conversations and the lessons and the quiet work of the management that continued through all the changes of the world outside. You can hear the city through the windows if you listen, the distant sound of traffic, the occasional voice, the particular hum of urban life going about its business. But inside the study the sound is smaller. The light is the sound almost, the dust is the sound, the house breathing is the sound, and somewhere in the quality of that sound, in the particular stillness of a room that has been worked in and is resting now, is the residue of all the afternoons that were spent here, all the lessons and the ledgers and the conversations and the quiet accumulation of a knowledge that was built in private and exercised in the spaces that the world allowed. If you find yourself thinking of a woman in your own family's history, someone who managed things quietly, who carried knowledge or competence that the world of her time did not fully acknowledge, whose story you only partially know, that recognition is not accidental. It is the recognition of a pattern that appears, in various forms, across the history of women who were given more than the social world expected them to be given, who used what they were given with the intelligence and the persistence that the gift required, and who left behind them, in the lives they managed and the inheritances they maintained, and the daughters they sometimes educated in their turn, the quiet evidence of what the afternoon light in the old study had made possible. The light is still moving, the house is still, rest now. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Engagement question. Is there a woman in your own family's history who managed things quietly, who carried knowledge or competence that the world of her time did not fully acknowledge, and whose story you only partially know?